Imagine living in a world where a journey from one city to the next can take not a few hours, but several days. Roads are often muddy, carriages uncomfortable, and the transport of goods is slow and expensive. News only spreads as fast as horses can carry it, and many people hardly leave their home village for the rest of their lives. And then suddenly an invention appears that changes everything: the railway. It brings people together faster, connects cities, grows factories, accelerates trade, and changes the sense of space and time. What previously seemed far away is suddenly getting closer. Networked economic areas are emerging from individual regions. Small stations become gateways to a new world. But the history of the railway is not only a history of progress and technology. It is also a story of power, hard work, political interests, military planning, and major social upheavals. Because the railway was more than just a new means of transport. It became a symbol of modernity. It brought hope, prosperity, and new opportunities, but it also served control, exploitation, and war. Their rails led through industrial centers, colonies, mountains, deserts, and battlefields. Wherever it was built, it changed people's lives. Before we dive into this fascinating story, feel free to write me in the comments. Which railway line, train, or station fascinates you the most and why? Maybe it's the Orient Express, the ICE, the Shinkansen, an old steam locomotive, or simply the train station of your hometown. If you are interested in history, technology, and the great turning points of humanity, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any more episodes. And now we travel back to the beginning of a development that put the world on rails. 1. The dream of movement on rails. Before the railway became a symbol of modernity, before steam locomotives emitted clouds of black smoke into the sky and people traveled from city to city at unprecedented speeds, its history began with a very simple human problem: how to move heavy loads more easily from one place to another. This question is much older than the locomotive, older than industrialization, and even older than the idea that people would one day travel in wagons over iron rails. It leads back to mines, quarries, workshops, and trading rooms, where people have tried for centuries with effort, strength, and inventiveness to make work easier and to make paths more predictable. The origin of the railway lies not in the desire for speed, but in the desire for relief. Anyone who had to transport heavy stones, wood, or coal knew that every meter was arduous. On dirt roads, wheels sank into mud, axles broke, animals exhausted themselves, and people had to work in conditions that were often dangerous and physically ruinous. This problem was particularly evident in mining. Underground, the paths were narrow, dark, damp, and uneven. Ore or coal had to be removed from the tunnels, often over long distances, before it could be further processed or sold. Any resistance meant more work, more time, and higher costs. Therefore, they were looking for methods that could make cars roll more easily. The first decisive idea was surprisingly simple: give the bikes a fixed track. Instead of letting wagons drive over irregular ground, wooden planks or simple rails were laid out on which the wheels could run better. Such early gauge paths were not yet railways in the modern sense, but they already contained the basic idea that would later change the world. If the wheel and path are coordinated, there is less friction. A wagon can carry heavier loads without the need for more traction. From this sober technical observation, a revolution in traffic gradually developed. In many mining regions of Europe, such wooden railways were built as early as the early modern period. Especially where ore, coal, or salt was mined, any improvement in transport was worthwhile. Wood was available, comparatively easy to work with, and could be laid in tunnels. The wagons were pushed by people or pulled by horses. Sometimes the wheels ran on the wooden rails, sometimes the cars were kept on track by lateral guides. Everything was still simple, raw, and locally limited. But the thought was born: the path itself could become a machine. Not only the vehicle was important, but also the route on which it moved. These early rail routes show that major technical upheavals rarely occur suddenly. They usually grow out of practical needs. No one built the first mine railways to change the world. The aim was to get or out of the mountain faster, protect horses, relieve workers, and reduce costs. But it is precisely such everyday problems that are often the beginning of major developments. The railway did not arise as a dream of a few theorists, but out of the harsh reality of work, trade, and material transport. Its roots lie where people struggle with weight, distance, and time on a daily basis. Over time, it became clear that wooden rails, while useful, were limited. They wore out, splintered, deformed due to moisture, and could only withstand heavy loads to a limited extent. In mines and on transport routes that were subject to heavy use, they often had to be repaired or replaced. Nevertheless, they were a great step forward compared to disorderly paths. They made movements more plannable and gave the transport a fixed direction. This was precisely where a decisive cultural change took place. Traffic was no longer determined solely by terrain, weather, and muscle power, but increasingly by technical planning. The next step was to improve the material. Where iron was available and metalworking progressed, wooden rails began to be shod with iron or completely replaced by iron elements. This transition was of enormous importance. Iron was more resistant, smoother, and more resilient. Carriages could become heavier, routes could last longer, and movement became more reliable. This was slowly approaching the form of rail transport that would later become the railway. But the decisive drive was still missing. As long as cars were moved by people or animals, the speed remained limited. Rail could lighten loads, but it could not yet create a new time order. Nevertheless, these early rail systems were already changing thinking. They made it clear that transport was not just movement, but a question of organization. Anyone who laid rails had to plan routes, observe gradients, calculate curves, select materials, and arrange work processes. That was more than craftsmanship. It was the beginning of an infrastructure. Anyone who reached a road could use it. A rail line, on the other hand, required suitable wagons, a fixed gauge, and maintenance. It created a system in which many parts had to work together. It was precisely this system thinking that later became decisive for the modern railway. Economically, too, the dream of moving on rails was closely linked to major changes. Europe grew, cities became larger, markets more demanding, and the demand for raw materials increased. Coal, or wood, and grain had to be transported in ever larger quantities. The more production and trade increased, the clearer the limits of traditional means of transport became. Rivers and canals were important, but they didn't go everywhere. Roads were expensive to maintain and often difficult to drive on. Horses could only pull limited loads and needed feed, care, and brakes. The desire for a reliable, efficient means of transport became increasingly urgent. There was a quiet tension in this development. On the one hand, there was the old world of slow paths, regional markets, and physical labor. On the other hand, a new idea of mobility emerged, in which distance was no longer considered an immutable fate. The rail embodied this new idea even before the steam locomotive came along. It promised order, direction, and relief. It turned a bad path into a predictable path. It was possible to plan how much load could be moved, how many wagons were needed, and which route was the cheapest. This made movement something that could be technically designed. It is important not to underestimate this beginning. When people talk about railways today, they immediately think of locomotives, stations, timetables, and long route networks. But none of this could have been created without the inconspicuous forerunners in mines and on factory railways. The idea that a wheel runs more efficiently on a fixed rail was the core. This core later grew into one of the most powerful infrastructures in human history. The railway was therefore not just an invention, but a chain of improvements, experiences, and adaptations. Each step prepared the next. The dream of moving on rails was not initially a romantic dream of traveling. It was a dream of less effort, of heavier loads, of better ways, and of greater control over space and work. But this was precisely where his strength lay. Because as soon as people realized that rails moved loads more easily, the next question inevitably arose: What would be possible if you no longer had to pull these carts only with muscle power or horses? What if a machine could power them? This question led directly to the age of the steam engine, and thus to the moment when simple railways became the railway, which was to change cities, states, and entire continents. 2. From wooden rails to iron paths. The development of the railway was not a single sudden breakthrough, but a long road made up of many small improvements. In the beginning, there were no elegant locomotives, no large stations, and no timetables, but simple transport routes that were supposed to do one thing above all: make heavy loads easier to move. After people realized that cars needed less power on fixed tracks than on muddy or uneven paths, a quiet technical revolution began. It did not take place on large stages, but in mines, metallurgical plants, quarries, and early industrial plants. Where coal or wood, salt or stones had to be moved every day, every progress was immediately noticeable. The first rails were made of wood. This was obvious, because wood was available in many regions, easy to work with and comparatively cheap. In mines, planks or beams were laid in such a way that small wagons could walk along them. These wagons were pushed, pulled, or moved by horses. For the workers, this meant an enormous relief, because a wagon that rolled on a fixed track could be loaded much more heavily than a wagon that had to be pulled over bare ground. Especially underground, where space was tight and distances were difficult, such simple rail systems could make the difference between laborious manual work and regulated transport. But holes had clear boundaries. It was susceptible to moisture, rot, and wear and tear. In mines, where water, dust, and constant stress were part of everyday life, wooden rails wore out quickly. They could splinter, warp, or break. The heavier the cars became, the more severe this problem became. In addition, irregular wooden surfaces caused friction and vibrations. A wooden track was better than a bad dirt road, but it remained a delicate tool. The growing demands of mining and early industry demanded a material that was harder, smoother, and more resilient. The transition from wood to iron use was initially cautious. The wooden rails were not completely replaced immediately, but reinforced with iron fittings. Thin iron plates were nailed to the wooden tracks so that the wheels could roll better and the surface lasted longer. This solution combined the inexpensive and simple construction of wood with the higher resistance of iron. This was an important step for the operators of such railways, because repairs cost time and money. The less often rails had to be replaced, the more reliable the entire transport became. However, these early iron fittings also brought new difficulties. If the iron plates came loose or bent up at the ends, they could damage wagons or endanger workers. Sometimes they tore themselves out of the wood, especially when heavy loads rolled over it. Such problems show that technical development rarely proceeds in a straight line. An improvement solves a problem, but often creates new challenges. Nevertheless, the direction was clear. Iron proved to be the material of the future because it was better able to cope with the increasing weight of transport than wood. With the improvement of iron production, it became possible to produce entire rails from iron. That was a huge step forward. Iron rails were more resilient, more uniform, and more durable. They allowed heavier cars and longer distances. They also make transport more predictable. Where previously a soggy path, a damaged wooden plank, or a broken beam could disrupt the process, a more stable foundation was now created. Rail became more and more a technical system that could be relied upon. This change was closely related to the development of the iron industry. Without better blast furnaces, without progressive metal processing, and without increasing production of iron, there would have been no modern railway. Rail itself was a product of the industrial world that was later to accelerate it at full speed. This shows an important connection. The railway did not emerge outside of industrialization, but out of it. Mining, iron processing, mechanical engineering, and transport technology developed mutually. More mining required better transport routes. Better transport routes made it possible to mine more. More iron production made better rails possible. Better rails, in turn, make larger transports profitable. The early wagon railways were particularly important in British mining regions. There, coal mines, metallurgical plants, and ports were connected by railroads. Coal was the fuel of industrialization, and its transportation was a central economic issue. If coal was transported too expensively, everything that was operated with it also became more expensive: machines, stoves, factories, and households. More efficient coal transport could change entire production chains. That is why railways were not built out of technical playfulness, but out of economic pressure. They were supposed to reduce costs, increase volumes, and speed up processes. Early rail technology remained strongly influenced by horse farming. Horses pulled wagons on the rails, often in a steady rhythm, over short or medium distances. A horse could move a much greater load on rails than on an ordinary road. This made such railways particularly attractive. In a way, they were an intermediate form between the old and new worlds. The drive remained traditional, but the infrastructure was already modern. The machine was not yet the center of attention, but the path was prepared. To a certain extent, the railways were waiting for a more powerful drive. The shape of the rails and wheels also evolved. It had to be decided whether the track should be held by raised edges on the rail or by wheel flanges on the wheels. Such details seem small at first glance, but they were decisive. A railway only works if the vehicle and the route fit together exactly. Wheels, axles, track gauge, rail profile, and substructure had to be coordinated. This gave rise to a new technical way of thinking. You couldn't just put any car on any track. Everything had to be planned as a system. This system formation had far-reaching consequences. Anyone who built a railway line not only laid two tracks on the ground, but also created a fixed order of traffic. The route determined where movement was possible. The track gauge determined which vehicles could be used. The load-bearing capacity of the rails determined how heavy the wagons could be. The gradient determined the tractive force required. This created an infrastructure that required planning, capital, maintenance, and expertise. The construction of railway lines thus became a task for entrepreneurs, engineers, and larger companies. With the spread of iron rails, the perception of transport also changed. Movement became less random and less dependent on weather and ground conditions. Of course, rails could be damaged, and even early trains were by no means trouble-free. But compared to muddy country roads or steep cart paths, they offered a new level of reliability. For traders, mine owners, and manufacturers, this was decisive. They didn't just want to know that goods would arrive at some point. They wanted to be able to plan when and in what quantity they would arrive. The railways made this planability possible. At the same time, the transition to iron roads was also a sign of growing economic power. Iron rails were more expensive than simple wooden planks. They demanded capital and access to metal. Those who could build such roads usually had greater resources or an industry strong enough to support such investments. As a result, railways also became symbols of a new economic order. They belonged to regions where production, technology, and capital came together. Where there were rails, it became apparent that work and transport were increasingly organized, accelerated, and geared towards growth. But despite all the progress, a crucial problem remained. The rails were now more stable, the wagons more resilient, and transport more efficient. But the drive was still based on muscle power, mostly on horses. This set natural limits. Horses had to be fed, they got tired, they could get sick, and their performance was limited. The greater the loads and the longer the distances became, the more clearly this boundary became apparent. Rail had paved the way, but it had not yet been able to reach its full potential. This is precisely why the development of wooden rails into iron paths was so important. It created the prerequisite for everything that came later. Without resilient rails, no steam locomotive would have been able to pull heavy wagons permanently. Without a fixed track, regular rail traffic could not have been created. Without the experience gained from mines and factory railways, engineers would not have known which loads, curves, gradients, and materials were decisive. The great railways of the 19th century stood on the shoulders of these early, often inconspicuous transport railways. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is an important insight. The railway did not begin with speed, but with resistance. People wanted to overcome the resistance of the ground, reduce the burden of work, and make transport more predictable. Wooden rails were the first step, iron paths the second. They transformed paths into technical paths and turned movement into a plannable system. But it was only when the power of the steam engine was added that this system turned into one of the most powerful inventions in modern history. The rails were ready. Now all that was missing was the machine that would fill them with new speed. 3. The steam engine changes everything. Without the steam engine, the history of the railway would not have become the enormous upheaval that changed entire societies in the 19th century. Rails already existed, wagons already existed, and the idea of moving heavy loads more easily on fixed tracks had also been known for a long time. But as long as people or animals had to pull the wagons, transport remained bound by natural limits. Horses could do a lot, especially on rails, but they had to be fed, they needed rest, they could get sick, and their strength only lasted up to a certain point. The real revolution began at the moment when the rail was connected to a machine that never tired like an animal and whose power came from fire, water, and metal. The steam engine was more than just a technical invention. It was a symbol of a new epoch in which people began to systematically control natural forces and transform them into work. The basic principle was simple and powerful at the same time. Water was heated, the resulting steam generated pressure, and this pressure could produce movement. What sounds sober in theory has had enormous consequences in practice. Suddenly, power could be generated where there was fuel and water. They were no longer solely dependent on wind, water wheels, muscle power, or animal power. A machine could drive pumps, move hammers, operate spinning machines, and finally pull wagons on rails. The early steam engines were not initially developed for transport. They were mainly used for mining. In mines, water was a big problem. The deeper the shafts became, the more often water penetrated, and the more difficult it became to keep the pits dry. Before the steam engine, pumps had to be operated with human power, animal power, or water power. That was tedious and limited. Steam engines were able to solve this problem much better. They pumped water out of the shafts and made deeper and more productive mines possible. The close connection between mining, steam, and railways is already evident here. The coal that later fired locomotives was extracted by machines that consumed coal themselves. Industrialization created its own cycle, so to speak. In the 18th century, steam engines became more and more powerful. Improvements that made them more efficient, reliable, and economical were particularly crucial. Earlier machines consumed a lot of fuel and were cumbersome, but with technical advances, they became more versatile. Not only could they drive pumps, but they could also generate rotary motion, which was central to factories and machines. The steam engine thus left the narrow realm of mining and became the heart of industrial production. It powered spinning mills, rolling mills, and many other plants. In doing so, she changed not only technology, but also the world of work. Factories could become larger, production could be concentrated, and work rhythms were increasingly based on machines instead of daylight, seasons, or craft traditions. The connection between the steam engine and rail traffic arose from an obvious question. If steam can drive an engine, why shouldn't that machine also move a car? This question was by no means easy to solve. A stationary steam engine could be large and heavy, because it stayed in one place. A locomotive, on the other hand, had to move itself. It had to be strong enough to pull wagons, but at the same time light enough to be able to run on rails. She had to carry her boiler, her fuel, her water, and her mechanics with her. In addition, the rails had to be stable enough to support this weight. Several technical developments came together here: better iron processing, more stable rails, more precise mechanical engineering technology, and a growing need for efficient transport. The first attempts with steam-powered vehicles were difficult. There were doubts as to whether smooth iron wheels would have sufficient grip on smooth iron rails. Many believed that a locomotive could not properly transfer its power to the rails and would only spin. Others feared that the machines were too heavy and would destroy the rails. In addition, there were security problems. Steam boilers were under high pressure, and if materials or construction failed, explosions could be fatal. Early locomotives were noisy, dirty, unreliable, and scary for many people. They seemed like alien beings of fire and iron, invading a world where speed had hitherto been something natural and limited. Nevertheless, the idea could no longer be stopped. The economic pressure was too great. Coal mines, ironworks, and factories needed better means of transport. The more was produced, the more important the question of how raw materials and goods could be moved became. Canals were useful, but they were slow and tied to waterways. Roads were often bad and expensive for heavy loads. Horse-drawn trams on rails were a step forward, but their performance remained limited. The steam locomotive promised something completely new: regular, strong, relatively fast transport independent of animal power. This made it a tool that was a perfect fit for the industrial world. The steam engine also changed man's relationship to time. Pre-industrial mobility was often uncertain. Weather, road conditions, animal exhaustion, and local obstacles determined how long a journey or transport took. With steam power and rail, it was possible to plan movements more precisely. Of course, early railways were not as punctual and organized as later railway systems, but the idea of regulated traffic became more and more realistic. Machines could be used according to timetables, routes could be calculated, transport quantities could be calculated, and costs could be determined more precisely. Traffic thus became part of a new order in which time became measurable, plannable, and economically usable. At the same time, the steam engine was an engine of social change. It made larger factories possible. Larger factories demanded more raw materials. More raw materials demanded better transport routes, and better transport routes in turn accelerated the growth of industry. The railway arose from this context and later strengthened it enormously. It was not only a consequence of industrialization, but also became its strongest accelerator itself. Coal, iron, mechanical engineering, and capital were combined in it. A locomotive was made of iron and steel, was coal-powered, ran on metal rails, and was used to move more coal, iron, goods, and people. Hardly any invention embodied the logic of the industrial world so clearly. For many people, however, steam power was not only a hope, but also a threat. Machines changed jobs, displaced old professions, and created new dependencies. Where craftsmen, carters, horse owners, or local traders used to perform certain tasks, larger technical and economic systems were now created. Those who had access to machines, coal, capital, and railways gained power. Those who were excluded from this could fall behind. The steam engine brought progress, but this progress was unevenly distributed. Some became rich, others had to work under harsh conditions in factories, mines, or in the construction of transport routes. The technology promised liberation from hardship, but at the same time created new forms of hard work. The steam engine also changed the imagination culturally. Smoking chimneys, pounding pistons, and rhythmically working machines became signs of a new era. The world seemed to be getting faster, louder, and bigger. The machine was no longer just a tool, but a power that changed landscapes, cities, and ways of life. When this force was applied to the rails, it was given a visible direction. The locomotive became a moving symbol of industrialization. She not only pulled cars behind her, but also expectations, fears, and visions of the future. Some saw it as the triumph of human ingenuity. Others saw noise, danger, and the loss of a familiar order. The decisive step was to make the steam engine small, mobile, and powerful enough to serve as a locomotive. This required courage, technical knowledge, and the willingness to learn from failures. Early designers had to experiment with boiler pressure, weight, suspension, rail stability, fuel consumption, and traction. Each improvement brought the idea of a real railway closer. In the beginning there were individual attempts, often on short distances and mostly in the vicinity of mines. However, these experiments gave rise to the conviction that steam-powered rail vehicles were not only possible, but also economically viable. This created the basis for the modern railway. The rails had prepared the way, the iron industry had supplied the material, the mining industry had provided supplies and fuel, and the steam engine provided the power. From these elements arose a connection that was stronger than any individual invention on its own. The steam locomotive was not a miracle out of nowhere, but the result of a long development. But when she prevailed, she actually worked like a miracle. It could move loads, transport people, and shorten distances that had previously been taken for granted. The steam engine changed everything because it freed movement from the limits of muscle power. It made the splint more than just an aid. It turned it into a traffic artery of the modern world. The practical desire to move heavy loads more easily now became the beginning of a new era. The next big step was to turn this power into reliable locomotives. This is exactly where the engineers who gave the railway a face came onto the scene. One of them became particularly famous, George Stephenson, whose name is still associated with the rise of the steam locomotive. 4. George Stephenson and the first locomotives. When you tell the story of the railway, there is hardly any way around George Stephenson. To this day, his name stands for the breakthrough of the steam locomotive, although he was not the only one to invent what would later shape the modern railway. Before him, other engineers had already experimented with steam-powered vehicles, and many designers after him also worked on improvements. But Stephenson was one of those people who was in the right place at the right time, combined practical experience with technical flair, and turned individual attempts into a functioning system. This is precisely why he became a key figure in railway history. George Stephenson was born in 1781 in Wylam in the north of England, a region that was heavily influenced by coal mining. His origins were modest. He did not grow up as an educated academic, but in a world of hard work in which machines, mines, horse-drawn trams, and coal transports were part of everyday life. This environment shaped him more than any university could have done. Stephenson didn't learn technique first from books, but from direct experience. He saw how mines worked, what problems arose when transporting coal, and how important reliable machines were for the economic success of a mine. It was not until he grew up that he learned to read and write on a larger scale, but his practical understanding of mechanics was extraordinary. This origin is crucial to understanding its meaning. Stephenson was not a man of abstract theory, but a man of workshops, pits, and test tracks. He knew that a locomotive didn't just have to work on paper. It had to withstand mud, dust, under load, and in daily operation. It had to be reparable, economical, and reliable. It was precisely this practical view that distinguished successful railway pioneers from many early visionaries. The steam locomotive was not an elegant idea alone, but a machine that had to work in a harsh industrial environment. Even before Stephenson, there had been important experiments. Richard Trevithick had built steam-powered vehicles at the beginning of the 19th century and showed that a locomotive could basically move heavy loads on rails. But the early engines were often too heavy for the existing rails, consumed a lot of fuel, or were not reliable enough. The problem lay not only in the locomotive itself, but in the interaction of machine, rail, wagon, and track. A good locomotive was of little use if the rails broke. Stable rails were of little use if the machine was too weak. The railway had to be thought of as a whole. Stephenson recognized exactly this connection. In the coal regions of northern England, wagons were already being pulled on rails by horses. The question was whether steam could replace these horses. For mine owners, this was not a romantic vision, but an economic calculation. Horses were expensive, had to be cared for, and had limited strength. A functioning steam locomotive could pull larger loads and speed up the transport of coal, but it had to justify its price. The owners didn't want a technical gimmick, but a tool that brought profit. Stephenson therefore worked not only on machines, but on a practical solution for industrial transport. His first locomotive was built in 1814 and bore the name Blucher. It was used to transport coal in a mining area. From today's perspective, this machine was still simple, slow, and cumbersome. But it showed that steam power could be used in regular operation on rails. Particularly important was the realization that smooth iron wheels could develop enough grip on smooth rails to pull cars. Many had previously doubted whether this was possible. Some designers had therefore thought about gears or other auxiliary systems. Stephenson and other practitioners showed that the friction between wheel and rail was sufficient if weight, power, and construction were properly tuned. In the following years, Stephenson continued to improve his locomotives. He worked on power transmission, stability, wheels, and the use of steam. It became increasingly clear that the locomotive was only one part of a larger system. The rails had to be uniform and strong enough. The route had to be planned in such a way that gradients and curves remained controllable. The cars had to fit the gauge. Maintenance and operation also became important. A railway was not simply a machine on wheels, but a technical network of vehicles, rails, people, signals, workshops, and operating rules. Stephenson's importance grew especially with the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in 1825. This line was originally intended primarily for coal transport, but was soon also connected with passenger traffic. It was a decisive step because it showed that a steam-powered railway could work not only inside a mine or industrial plant, but on a public line. On the inaugural run, Stephenson's locomotive Locomotion No. 1 pulled wagons with coal and passengers. The speed was low by today's standards, but the effect was enormous. People saw that a machine could pull cars over rails, not just as an experiment, but as a means of public transport. This opening was a moment in which technology became a social experience. For many viewers, the sight must have been eerie and fascinating at the same time. A steaming engine moved with a force that depended neither on horses, nor on wind, nor on water. It generated noise, smoke, and vibration. It smelled of coal, oil, and hot metal. She was not beautiful in the traditional sense, but she embodied a new power. It showed that distance could be thought of differently. What had previously been laborious and slow could now become more regular, stronger, and faster. Before the opening, a decision had to be made as to which locomotive was best suited for the line. In 1829, the famous Rainhill competition took place. Different constructions competed against each other, but Stephenson's rocket prevailed. The rocket was not only faster than most previous locomotives, but also technically groundbreaking. Particularly important were its multi-tube boiler and improved steam generation. This allowed more heat to be transferred to the water, which increased performance. The machine was lighter, more powerful, and more reliable than many competitors. It became a symbol of the fact that the steam locomotive was now ready for large-scale use. The rocket was more than a technical success. It was a piece of evidence at a time of great doubt. Many people feared that high speeds could harm the human body. Others warned of accidents, fires, or economic losses. Haulage companies and canal owners saw their business models threatened. Landowners feared encroachments on their properties. Doctors, clergymen, politicians, and entrepreneurs discussed the benefits and dangers. From the very beginning, the railway was not only a technical project, but a social conflict. It promised progress, but threatened existing interests and habits. When the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, a new era finally began. The line was the first major railway line to regularly transport both goods and passengers between two major cities, relying heavily on steam locomotives. This made it clear that the railway was not only suitable for mines or individual industrial companies, but also for general traffic. This had enormous consequences. If two cities could be connected in this way, why not others? If goods could be transported faster, why not rearrange entire markets? If people could cover distances in one day that would have taken them much longer in the past, what did that mean for work, trade, politics, and everyday life? Stephenson became famous for these successes. But his fame was not based solely on personal genius. He stood for a generation of technicians, workers, and entrepreneurs who created a new infrastructure together. He benefited from the coal industry, advances in mechanical engineering, better rails, and a society that demanded faster transportation. Nevertheless, his role was extraordinary. He knew how to connect the individual elements. He built locomotives, planned routes, convinced financiers, and showed through practical results that the railway could be more than a risky experiment. The early locomotives were still a long way from the powerful machines of later decades. They were vulnerable, noisy, and technically raw to today's eyes. But they fundamentally changed the possibilities of transport. Their importance was not only in speed, but in repeatability. A locomotive could pull wagons day after day. It could be integrated into timetables. It was able to move raw materials, goods, and people to a degree that exceeded previous means of transport. This made the railway predictable and economically attractive. George Stephenson died in 1848, but by that time the railway had already begun to change Britain and Europe. The coal railways of northern England had become a transport system that would soon pass through countries, continents, and empires. His life shows how closely the railway was linked to practical experience, industrial work, and technical courage. The son of a simple worker became a man whose machines changed the way we think about space, time, and progress. The locomotive was no longer an uncertain idea. It had become reality. And with it began the time in which the railway rose from a tool of mining to the great means of transport of the modern world. 5. The first railway for passengers. When the railway began to transport people, its meaning changed fundamentally. Previously, it had been primarily a tool of mining and industry. It moved coal, or stones, and other heavy goods. Their economic benefits were clearly recognizable, but their effect on the lives of ordinary people was initially limited. It was only when passengers boarded railway carriages in larger numbers that a technical transport solution became a social event. The railway stepped out of the mines, factory railways, and industrial zones and became a new means of public transport. This marked the beginning of a development that changed not only markets, but also everyday life, thinking, and expectations. The idea of transporting people on rails was by no means a matter of course at first. Many early railways had been built for goods, especially coal. People could ride along, but often on the side, sometimes in simple carriages that offered hardly any comfort. For many contemporaries, this was unusual and even unsettling. A steaming machine that rolled over rails with noise, smoke, and sparks seemed like an intervention in the natural order to people who were used to carriages, horses, and slow country roads. Speed was not an everyday occurrence at that time. Traveling meant effort, dust, bad roads, weather risks, and long duration. The idea that you could drive a machine regularly and comparatively quickly from one place to another was revolutionary. An important step was the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in 1825. It was originally intended primarily for coal transport, but its opening already showed that the railway could do more. George Stephenson's locomotive locomotion, number 1, pulled wagons with coal and people at the same time. For those present, this was a spectacle that triggered technical curiosity, amazement, and skepticism at the same time. The line connected mining, trade, and the public in a new way. Passenger transport was not yet organized as it was later known, but the idea had become visible. The railway could not only move goods, but also people. This realization was of enormous significance, because as soon as people themselves experienced the new speed, the railway was no longer perceived only as an industrial machine, but as part of one's own life. Anyone sitting in a railway carriage immediately felt that distance was changing. A place that had previously been far away was getting closer. A trip that used to last a whole day or more has been shortened. This changed expectations. Merchants could travel faster, families could be visited more easily, workers could move between places, and news spread faster. The railway thus interfered with one's personal sense of time. She made speed an experience that belonged not only to entrepreneurs and engineers, but also to travelers. The real breakthrough of regular passenger services came with the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in 1830. This route was a turning point in many respects. It connected two economically important cities, Liverpool as a large port and Manchester as the center of the textile industry. There was a huge need for transport between the two places. Cotton, finished textiles, coal, machinery, and people moved between the port and the industrial city. Until then, canals and roads had carried this traffic, but they were slow, expensive, or congested. The railway offered a completely new way to connect goods and passengers faster and more predictably. The opening of this line was an event of national importance. Politicians, entrepreneurs, engineers, and onlookers watched as the railway entered a new role. It was no longer just a tool for mines, but a public transport system between large cities. But even this moment also showed the dangers of the new technology. At the opening, there was a tragic accident when the politician William Huskisson was hit by a locomotive and fatally injured. The accident made it clear that the railroad was a new power whose rules had to be learned. Speed brought opportunities, but also risks. People had to understand that a locomotive could not simply stop immediately like a horse-drawn carriage. Stations, tracks, signals, and safety distances had to be rethought. Despite such fears, passenger transport quickly prevailed. People were curious, and many soon realized the practical benefits. The railroad was faster than the carriage, more reliable than bad roads, and often cheaper when many people were transported. In the beginning, there were clear differences between the travel classes. Wealthy passengers traveled in closed, better-equipped cars, while poorer travelers often sat in simple open cars, exposed to wind, smoke, and weather. Even here, it became clear that the railway promised new mobility, but did not eliminate social differences. She transported the social order of her time. Those who had money traveled more comfortably. Those who had little also made progress, but under much tougher conditions. Nevertheless, the railway had a democratizing power. It made travel possible for people who could hardly afford longer carriage rides. Over time, excursion trips, workers' trains, and cheaper travel offers emerged. Cities moved closer together, and people began to perceive their surroundings differently. The surrounding area of a city became more accessible. Markets, jobs, and leisure places changed. Sunday could now be used for an excursion. A visit to relatives in another city became more realistic. The railroad began to influence not only the big economy, but also small life decisions. The effect on the sense of time was particularly profound. Before the railroad, places often had their own local times, which were based on the position of the sun. This was not a problem as long as travel was slow. But with fast train connections, it became necessary to precisely coordinate departures, arrivals, and connections. The railway demanded precise timekeeping. Timetables became a new part of everyday life. People had to stick to fixed departure times. Delay took on a new meaning. Time was no longer only experienced approximately, but organized in minutes. Later, the railway made a significant contribution to the implementation of uniform time standards. In doing so, she changed something that had a deep impact on everyday life, the rhythm of life. Train stations also became new places of modern society, where passengers got on and off. Waiting rooms, ticket offices, luggage rooms, platforms, and later large reception buildings were built. The station was not just a technical point on a line, but a gateway to the world. People from different backgrounds met here. Businessmen, workers, soldiers, families, emigrants, and travelers moved through the same space, albeit often separated by class and area. Train stations became places of farewell and arrival, of hope and uncertainty. For many people, a new phase of life began there: a job, a trip, emigration, or return home. Passenger transport also changed the perception of landscape. Those who traveled in a carriage felt every unevenness of the road, heard the clatter of hooves, smelled the dust, and moved to the rhythm of the horses. The railway offered a different experience. The landscape glided by faster. Places were transformed into a sequence of images. Some people found this exciting, others unnatural. Writers, artists, and critics described the railway partly as a miracle, partly as a loss. It brought closeness, but also acceleration. It connected, but it also rushed past landscapes. The modern journey began to produce a new way of seeing. Passenger transport was also important for entrepreneurs and states. He showed that railways were not only economic burden bearers, but could also generate income from a broad audience. The more people traveled, the more worthwhile routes, stations, and other investments were. The success of early passenger lines convinced financiers and politicians that railways had a future. This gave rise to a veritable railway fever in many countries. New companies were founded, shares were issued, routes were planned, and cities were connected. Passenger transport became visible proof that the railway would not remain on the fringes of industry, but would move into the center of society. But the new mobility also had its downsides. The construction of lines encroached on landscapes and property relations. People lost land, villages were cut through, traditional transport professions came under pressure. Coachmen, carters, canal operators, and inns on old travel routes had to adapt or disappear. At the same time, new professions emerged: train drivers, stokers, conductors, switchmen, dispatchers, railway workers, and mechanics. The railway destroyed old working environments and created new ones. It was thus a typical sign of modernity. It brought progress, but not without conflict. The first railway for passengers was therefore much more than a new means of travel. It was a social upheaval on wheels. It showed people that speed could be planned, bought, and repeated. It connected cities more closely, changed work and leisure, created new places of transport, and forced societies to rethink security, time, space, and organization. The machine of mining became a means of transport for the public. Rails for coal became paths for people. And with every passenger who boarded a train, it became clearer that the railway did not only transport goods. It transported the world into a new age. 6. The railway and industrialization. In the 19th century, the railway became one of the most important driving forces of industrialization. It was not just a new means of transport, but a powerful tool that fundamentally changed the economy, society, space, and time. Factories could grow, cities could expand, raw materials could be moved in ever-increasing quantities, and markets that had previously been separated by distance, poor roads, and high transportation costs were connected. The railway was thus not only a result of the Industrial Revolution, but also one of its strongest accelerators. It arose from coal, iron, capital, and mechanical engineering and became precisely the system that allowed coal, iron, capital, and mechanical engineering to grow even more. Before the railroad, many economic opportunities were limited by transportation. A factory could only produce permanently if it was reliably supplied with raw materials and could bring its goods to customers. Roads were often bad, especially in rain, snow, or heavy traffic. Horse-drawn wagons could only move limited loads and were expensive to maintain. Rivers and canals offered good transport facilities in some regions, but they were tied to natural watercourses or artificially created routes. Those who were not near such a waterway had disadvantages. The railway broke through these barriers. It could be built specifically where mines, factories, ports, or cities had to be connected. This made traffic more plannable and economically efficient. The railway was particularly important for the transport of coal. Coal was the central fuel of industrialization. It heated steam engines, powered factories, supplied households, and made iron production possible. Without coal, industrial development could not have taken place in this form. But coal was heavy, dirty, and expensive to transport if there were no good roads. The railway solved exactly this problem. It was able to move large quantities of coal regularly and comparatively cheaply. This made factories less dependent on the immediate vicinity of mines. Industrial regions were able to network more closely, and the energy supply became more reliable. Where coal arrived cheaper, machines could run longer, production could increase, and prices could fall. At the same time, the railway itself needed enormous quantities of iron and later steel. Rails, locomotives, wagons, bridges, wheels, axles, signaling systems, and station buildings demanded metal, machines, and skilled work. This made the railway a huge customer for heavy industry. Ironworks and machine factories benefited directly from railway construction. The more lines were built, the greater the need for rails and locomotives. The greater this demand became, the more profitable it was to expand production. The railway therefore not only drove transport, but also the industries that produced it itself. A cycle of mutual reinforcement developed between the railways and industry. Mechanical engineering also received a huge boost from the railway. Locomotives were complex machines that had to be manufactured precisely and maintained regularly. They demanded qualified workers, engineers, workshops, and technical standards. Each new locomotive was the result of experience, calculation, and craftsmanship. The construction of railways therefore promoted the development of technical professions and industrial expertise. Machine factories became larger, more specialized, and more efficient. The railway was thus also a school of modern technology. It forced people to plan more precisely, to check materials better, and to organize processes more reliably. Another crucial point was the connection of markets. Before the railway, many regions were more economically separated from each other. Local markets determined what was produced, bought, and sold. Goods from distant regions were expensive because they cost a lot of time and money to transport. With the railway, transport costs and travel times decreased. This allowed food, raw materials, and industrial products to be traded over greater distances. Farmers were able to bring their produce to cities more easily. Factories were able to sell their goods to more distant regions. Retailers were able to open up larger sales areas. The railway turned many small, partly closed economic areas into increasingly larger national and international markets. This development had profound consequences for the cities. Industrial cities grew particularly fast where railway lines combined raw materials, labor, and sales markets. Train stations became new hubs of urban life. Warehouses, hotels, factories, workshops, and residential areas were built around them. Cities were no longer shaped only by rivers, roads, or old trade routes, but increasingly by rails. A city with a railway connection would have better chances of economic growth. A city without a connection could fall behind. The course of railway lines often decided on the rise and loss of importance of entire regions. The world of work also changed massively. The railroad created new professions and new forms of organization. Train drivers, stokers, conductors, switchmen, track workers, engineers, dispatchers, station masters, and mechanics became part of a new professional world. This work required discipline, punctuality, and technical reliability. A train couldn't just run at some point. It had to run according to plan because other trains, connections, and route assignments depended on it. In doing so, the railway brought a new order to the world of work. Time was measured more accurately, processes were more strictly coordinated, and errors could have serious consequences. The railway was therefore not only a transport system, but also a system of discipline. For many workers, the railway meant new opportunities, but also new hardships. The construction of railway lines was physically difficult and dangerous. Workers had to build dams, dig tunnels, build bridges, lay rails, and often live in difficult conditions. Many were poorly paid and hardly protected. Accidents were frequent. At the same time, the railway opened up new jobs and made mobility possible. People were able to reach more distant places of work. Job seekers could move to industrial regions. The railway thus contributed to the emergence of modern labor markets. It connected not only goods with markets, but also people with jobs. However, industrialization brought not only growth, but also social tensions. Factory work was often hard, housing conditions in fast-growing cities were poor, and the gap between employers and workers became visible. The railway was part of this development. It stood for progress and prosperity, but also for exploitation and unequal distribution. Entrepreneurs and investors were able to make large profits from railway projects, while many workers built and worked in dangerous conditions. The shiny side of modernism had a dark back. Every rail, every bridge, and every station was also the result of human effort, political decisions, and economic interests. Politically, the railway also became an instrument of power. States quickly realized that rail networks were not only economically, but also strategically important. Those who controlled railway lines controlled the flow of goods, troop movements, and communication routes. The railways helped to bind regions more closely to national centers. It strengthened administrations, facilitated state control, and made it possible to mobilize resources more quickly. In many countries, railway construction was therefore not left to private companies alone. The state intervened, promoted routes, regulated tariffs, or later took over entire networks. The railway became an infrastructure that reorganized the relationship between the state, the economy, and society. The railway also changed life culturally in the industrial age. It made speed visible and tangible. People could visit relatives, visit exhibitions, travel to health resorts, or get to know new cities. Newspapers and letters arrived faster. Goods from distant regions became more commonplace. The sense of distance changed. What used to be far away could now be reached within a day. This change influenced people's thinking. The world seemed smaller, faster, and more connected. The railway became the symbol of an era that believed in progress, technology, and growth. But this belief in progress was not unbroken. Many people perceived the new speed as threatening. Smoke, noise, and rails cut through landscapes. Traditional ways and ways of life were displaced. Some saw the railway as a sign of human greatness, others as a symbol of reckless acceleration. This tension accompanies modernity to this day. The railway brought freedom and dependence at the same time. It connected people, but it also subjected them to a new rhythm. It created prosperity, but also competitive pressure. It shortened distances, but it permanently changed landscapes and working environments. In the end, it can be said that the railway formed the backbone of industrialization. It transported not only coal, iron, cotton, grain, and machinery, but also ideas, labor, political power, and social changes. Without them, the Industrial Revolution could have been slower, more regionally limited, and less profound. The railroad made growth agile. It transformed individual factories into industrial networks, cities into hubs, and countries into contiguous economic areas. It was the steel vein of a new world that was characterized by energy, production, and speed. And that is precisely why it became perhaps the clearest symbol of the 19th century: loud, sooty, powerful, contradictory, and unstoppable. 7. Railway fever in Europe. When the first successful railway lines in Britain proved that steam locomotives could reliably transport not only coal and goods, but also people, a new idea of the future began to spread in Europe. The railway was no longer a technical curiosity from English coalfields, but became a symbol of progress, power, and economic advancement. Everywhere, entrepreneurs, politicians, engineers, and investors began to think about how rails could change their own countries. Cautious curiosity turned into enthusiasm. Enthusiasm became a race, and out of this race arose what was later called railway fever. This railway fever was more than a wave of technical enthusiasm. It was an economic, political, and social frenzy. The railway promised solutions to many problems at the same time. It was able to bring raw materials to factories more quickly, transport goods to markets more quickly, connect cities more closely, open up regions, and hold states closer together. For entrepreneurs, it meant profit opportunities. For governments, it meant control and strategic agility. For citizens, it meant new mobility. For engineers, it meant major tasks in which bridges, tunnels, stations, and routes through difficult terrain had to be planned. Rarely before had a technology attracted so many expectations. Great Britain initially remained the model. Their industrialization had begun earlier than in most other European countries. The country had coal, iron, capital, engineering, and an entrepreneurial culture that was willing to take risks. The British railways showed that money could be made with rail transport, even if the construction was expensive and some projects failed. Investors saw railway stocks as an opportunity to participate in progress. Newspapers reported on new routes, technical records, and economic opportunities. The railway became a topic of conversation in parliaments, stock exchanges, coffee houses, and workshops. Those who believed in the future often also believed in the railways. On the European mainland, these developments have been closely monitored. France, Belgium, the German states, Austria, and other countries faced similar questions. How could industrial centers be connected? How could ports, mining areas, and capitals be better connected? Should the state control railway construction or leave it to private companies? What track gauges, technical standards, and safety rules should apply? These questions alone show that the railway could not simply be built like an ordinary road. It required planning, capital, laws, and technical coordination. Anyone who built a railway intervened deeply in the order of a country. Belgium became a particularly important example early on. After its independence in 1830, the young kingdom looked for ways to strengthen its economic and political independence. The railway seemed ideal for this. It was able to connect the country's major cities and industrial areas, making Belgium a modern transport hub. The Belgian state played a strong role in the construction of the railway. This was significant because it showed a different path than in the UK, where private companies were particularly important. Belgium made it clear that railway policy could also mean state building. Rails were not only transport lines, but lines of national integration. In France, railway construction developed more slowly and in a more centralized manner. Paris was the political and economic center, and many routes were planned to be oriented towards the capital. This corresponded to the long French tradition of a strong central state. Railway lines were not only supposed to move goods, but also to order the country around its center. At the same time, there were fierce debates in France about financing, private concessions, and state control. Some feared speculation. Others saw the railway as a necessary prerequisite for economic progress. The result was a mixture of private capital and government control that had a strong impact on the French network. In the German states, the railway had a special significance because there was no unified nation-state yet. Germany consisted of many kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and political entities with their own interests. This is precisely why the railway was able to develop a unifying force here. It brought markets closer together, facilitated trade and travel, and strengthened the awareness of economic togetherness. The early route between Nuremberg and Fürth in 1835 was short, but had a great symbolic effect. It showed that the age of the railway had also begun in German states. Other lines soon followed, and with them grew the idea that rails could overcome fragmentation long before political unity was achieved. The railway fever was additionally fueled by economic hopes. Those who invested in railway lines early on could hope for high profits. Cities struggled to be connected to new lines, because a station could make the difference between economic advancement or backwardness. Merchants, manufacturers, and local politicians campaigned for routes that favored their region. Sometimes routes were planned not only according to technical or economic considerations, but also according to political pressure, local interests, and speculation. Entire regions feared being left behind if the rails passed them by. The railway connection became a vital question of modern development. At the same time, the construction of the railway was enormously expensive. Rails had to be produced, land purchased, bridges built, tunnels dug, and stations built. Engineers had to overcome rivers, mountains, valleys, and cities. Especially in mountainous regions, railway construction became a technical challenge. Every tunnel and every bridge was not just a structure, but a sign of human will to subordinate the landscape to speed. But the costs were high, and not every project fulfilled the hopes of its backers. Railway fever, therefore, also meant speculative fever. There were exaggerated expectations, risky investments, and financial crises when projects failed or revenues were missing. Despite these risks, the railway continued to spread because its benefits became more and more visible. Travel times shrank dramatically. A distance that had previously taken a day or more by carriage could now be covered in a few hours. Goods arrived faster and more regularly, and food was able to reach larger markets, which changed supplies and prices. Industrial products could continue to be sold. Newspapers, letters, and information spread faster. The railway was thus also a medium of communication, even if it did not transmit messages in the narrower sense. It got people and information moving, thereby changing the speed of public debate. The new mobility also had cultural consequences. Travel became possible for larger parts of the population. Although class differences remained clearly visible, as the first, second, and third-class carriages offered very different conditions, even ordinary travelers could now overcome distances that would have been difficult to reach before. Pilgrimages, excursions, visits to relatives, business trips, and later also holiday trips were facilitated by the railway. People began to perceive Europe differently. Landscapes, cities, and regions moved into a new relationship with each other. The continent didn't get smaller, but it felt smaller. The political elites also quickly recognized the strategic importance of the railway. Troops could be moved more quickly, supplies could be better organized, and border regions could be controlled more closely. This was particularly crucial at a time when nation-states, great powers, and military rivalries were gaining in importance. A railway line could bring economic prosperity, but in the event of war it could also become a military lifeline. Therefore, general staffs soon became very interested in route plans, junctions, and bridges. The railways were an instrument of peace and at the same time an instrument of war. This ambiguity was a large part of its historical significance. The railway fever also visibly changed the landscape of Europe. Rails cut through fields, dams rose above valleys, stations were built on the outskirts of cities and later in the middle of the cities. Smoking locomotives became part of everyday life. Where stagecoach stations, inns, and horse-changing places had previously been important, platforms, waiting rooms, goods sheds, and workshops were now built. Old transport routes lost their importance. New centers were created. Some cities grew because they became railway junctions. Others lost influence because the major lines bypassed them. Rail wrote a new geography of power and trade in Europe. But not everyone welcomed this development. Critics complained about noise, smoke, accidents, and the loss of familiar ways of life. Farmers feared for their land, carters for their work, inn owners on old roads for their guests. Some clergymen and conservative voices saw the speed as a danger to the order of life. Others warned against speculation and social unrest. The railway was a promise, but also an imposition. She demanded adaptation. It brought new rules, new times, new professions, and new dependencies. This is precisely how deeply it intervened in society. But its strongest effect was as a symbol. The railway stood for a world that was accelerating. It showed that technology could not only facilitate individual tasks, but also reshape entire societies. In Europe, it combined industrialization, capitalism, state building, military planning, and everyday mobility into one major historical process. The railway fever was therefore not just enthusiasm for locomotives. It was the expression of an era that believed in progress, but at the same time was marked by the tensions of this progress. Rails meant hope for prosperity, but also competition and control. They connected cities, but they separated winners from losers. They made Europe more flexible, but also more dependent on technology, capital, and planning. As the railroad spread across Europe in the 19th century, a new network of steel, smoke, and time emerged. This network connected not only places, but also interests. Manufacturers, states, workers, travelers, and soldiers became part of the same development. The railway fever showed how strongly a technical invention could capture the imagination of an entire continent. Individual lines became national networks became European connections. The railway had not invented Europe, but it gave the continent a new speed, a new order, and a new sense of closeness. This made it one of the decisive forces of the 19th century. 8. The railway in Germany. The history of the railway in Germany did not begin with a huge network, not with large main stations, and not with powerful express trains, but with a short route that nevertheless had enormous symbolic significance. On December 7, 1835, the first German railway with regular passenger transport ran between Nuremberg and Fürth. The locomotive bore the name Adler, had been built in England, and was driven by the English engine driver William Wilson. The route was only a few kilometers long, but it opened a gate to a new era. For many spectators, this train was a miracle of iron, smoke, and steam. He showed that the new technology was no longer just a British phenomenon, but had also arrived in the fragmented German area. At that time, Germany was not yet a nation-state. It consisted of many individual states, kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and political entities that had their own interests, administrations, and borders. This political fragmentation also shaped early railway construction. While Great Britain, as the industrial motherland of the railway, was able to fall back on a strong entrepreneurial culture and early industrialization, the German states first had to slowly get used to the new technology. Nevertheless, the need for better transport routes was great. The growing economy demanded faster connections, trade needed reliable transport routes, and many cities hoped to catch up with progress through a rail connection. The route between Nuremberg and Fürth was therefore much more than a technical attraction. It was a sign. Nuremberg was an old trading city with a long tradition, Fürth an up-and-coming commercial town. There was a lively exchange of goods and people between the two cities. The railroad promised to make this traffic faster and more regular. Initially, many viewed the railway with skepticism. Some feared health damage from the speed, others saw dangers from smoke, noise, or flying sparks. Carters and coachmen had to fear for their jobs, while traders and entrepreneurs recognized new opportunities. Even here, a pattern emerged that was to accompany the entire history of the railway. The railways brought progress, but they also interfered with existing ways of life. After the success of the first route, interest grew rapidly. Other lines were created, for example in Saxony, Prussia, Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg. The connection between Leipzig and Dresden became particularly important, which was one of the most important early German railway lines from the late 1830s onwards. It connected two economically and culturally important cities and showed that longer distances could be possible and profitable. Leipzig was a center of trade and trade fairs, Dresden a residential city of political and cultural importance. The railroad brought these spaces closer together and accelerated the exchange between them. This was a foretaste of what was to happen later throughout Germany. Railway construction in Germany was closely linked to industrialization, even though in many regions this began later than in Great Britain. Coal and iron played a central role in this. The Ruhr area, Silesia, Saxony, and Saarland in particular developed into important industrial areas. The railroad could bring coal to smelting plants, transport iron products to markets, and deliver machinery to growing factory regions. At the same time, railway construction itself required huge quantities of rails, locomotives, wagons, bridges, and technical equipment. As a result, the railway became an engine of German heavy industry. It created demand, jobs, and technical skills that had an impact far beyond transport. In Prussia, the state recognized the strategic importance of the railway early on. Prussia was a large, but not always spatially closed kingdom. whose provinces had to be connected to each other over long distances. Railway lines were able to strengthen administration, trade, and the military. They helped to bind distant regions more closely to the center and to better develop economic areas. The Prussian state was initially cautious and left much to private companies, but increasingly intervened in a regulating and controlling manner. Later, the railway in Prussia became more and more a state affair. This was not only for economic reasons, but also for political and military reasons. The German Customs Union, which was founded in 1834 and economically linked many German states more closely with each other, played a special role. It eliminated numerous internal tariffs and facilitated trade. The railway and the Zollverein strengthened each other. The Zollverein made larger markets possible, and the railroad made it easier to actually reach these markets. Goods could be transported more quickly across national borders without being held up by customs barriers at every small border. In this way, a contiguous economic area gradually emerged long before the German Empire was founded in 1871. In this sense, the railway was a tool of economic unification. The rails created connections where previously borders, bad roads, and long travel times separated. Anyone who wanted to travel from one German city to another now experienced a new feeling of closeness. Salesmen, students, civil servants, workers and families used the railway. Newspapers and letters spread faster. Trade fairs, markets, and political meetings became more accessible. The railway contributed to the fact that people perceived themselves more strongly as part of a larger space. It connected not only places, but also ideas. Germany was united not only by diplomacy and wars, but also by timetables, stations, freight tariffs, and rail connections. But this development was not uniform. Some regions benefited early on, others were initially left behind. Cities struggled to be connected to important lines, because a train station could make the difference between economic rise and bust. A city with a rail connection received raw materials more easily, could sell goods more quickly, and became more attractive for companies. A city without a connection often lost its importance. This created new regional inequalities. So the railroad was not simply a neutral network that helped everyone equally. It steered economic forces, changed locational advantages, and created winners and losers. The construction itself was also a huge achievement. Workers had to build dams, lay tracks, build bridges, and drive tunnels through mountains. Especially in the low mountain ranges and later in more difficult landscapes, railway construction became a technical challenge. Engineers had to plan routes in such a way that locomotives could cope with gradients. Rivers had to be crossed, valleys spanned, and cities connected. This resulted in buildings that were not only useful, but also created pride. Railway bridges and stations became signs of technical power. They showed that humans could shape the landscape according to the needs of modern mobility. The German railway stations quickly developed into important places of public life. In the beginning, many were comparatively simple, but as traffic grew, prestigious station buildings were built. Railway stations became gates to the city, places of movement, farewell, and arrival. Different social classes met here, albeit often separated by travel class. Businessmen, soldiers, emigrants, workers, families, and civil servants moved through the same halls. The station became a visible symbol of the new era. It combined technology, administration, trade, and personal life paths in one place. The railway also profoundly changed the military system in Germany. Prussian military planners recognized early on that troops and supplies could be moved much faster by rail than on foot or by horse-drawn cart. This insight became particularly important in the wars of the 19th century. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and the Franco-German War of 1870 and 1871, the railway played an important role in mobilization and supply. It made it possible to bring large masses of troops to certain places according to plan. This turned the roadmap into a military instrument. Railway lines were no longer only ways of trade, but also arteries of warfare. The War of 1870 and 1871 in particular showed the combination of technology, organization, and power. Prussia and its allies were able to use railway links to quickly move soldiers, weapons, and material towards the French border. Of course, railways were not the only ones that decided the war, but they were an important part of military superiority. The modern state showed its strength not only on the battlefield, but also in the ability to organize people, material, and information in a short time. The railway thus became the expression of a new form of state power. After the founding of the German Empire in 1871, the railway gained even greater importance. The new empire was politically united, but still economically and infrastructurally diverse. The railway helped to connect this diversity more closely. At the same time, the railway system remained federal, because the individual states continued to have their own railway administrations. Prussia in particular dominated with its large net. The question of how railways should be organized, nationalized, expanded, and financed became an important political issue. The railway had become too important to be regarded solely as a business of private companies. For the population, the railway gradually became more commonplace. Journeys that used to be arduous and expensive have become easier to plan. People could look for work in other cities, visit relatives, go on excursions, or send goods over longer distances. The railway brought new sounds, new smells, and new rhythms into everyday life. The whistle of the locomotive, the beating of the wheels, the smoke above the tracks, and the crowd on the platform became part of the modern experience. At the same time, society got used to timetables, punctuality, and technical organization. The railway educated people to a new time, so to speak. But the railways also had a dark side in Germany. It displaced older professions, destroyed familiar transport routes, cut through landscapes, and brought new social tensions with it. During construction, many people worked under harsh conditions. Accidents were not uncommon, and working in railway operations required a high level of discipline. In addition, the railway served not only peaceful purposes, but also military power and later in German history in a cruel way state violence. As early as the 19th century, it was visible that the same technology that connected people and created wealth could also be used for control and war. Despite this ambivalence, the importance of the railways for Germany can hardly be overestimated. It was an engine of industrialization, a tool of economic unification, an instrument of state power, and a part of everyday life. It connected regions that had long been politically separated and made the German region more flexible, faster, and more closely intertwined. Within a few decades, the short route between Nuremberg and Fürth developed into a dense network that connected cities, industrial areas, ports, and borders. The railway became one of the steel arteries that gave rise to modern Germany. In the end, German railway history shows particularly clearly that rails are more than technical lines in space. They are connections between business and politics, between everyday life and power, between progress and conflict. In Germany, the railway helped to form a common economic area out of many separate spaces. It accelerated industrialization and changed the idea of what proximity, distance, and national unity could mean. The Adler locomotive in 1835 was only the beginning. What followed was a web of iron, steam, and organization that profoundly shaped German history. 9. Rails across continents. When the railways formed their first large networks in Europe, an even greater vision soon emerged. Rails were no longer only to connect cities, no longer just to open up mines, factories, and ports, but to cross entire continents. The railway became the tool of a new spatial concept. Distances that used to seem almost insurmountable were to be conquered technically. Deserts, prairies, mountains, forests, and steppes were no longer seen merely as obstacles, but as spaces that could be opened up through planning, capital, labor, and political power. This marked the beginning of a phase in railway history in which the railways were not only a means of transport, but an instrument of expansion, domination, colonization, and economic penetration. This development was particularly evident in the United States. The country expanded further and further west in the 19th century, but there were huge spaces between the Atlantic coast and the Pacific. Covered wagons, rivers, and stagecoaches could bridge these distances, but slowly, dangerously, and expensively. The idea of a transcontinental railroad, therefore, became a national project. It was supposed to connect the East with the West, move settlers, goods, soldiers, and news more quickly, and bring the country together economically and politically. After the Civil War, this idea took on additional significance as the United States sought to consolidate its unity and expand its control over the West. The first transcontinental railroad in the United States was completed in 1869, when the lines built from the east and west met at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. The symbolic impact of the Golden Nail was celebrated as a triumph. Newspapers described it as a victory of progress over space and wilderness. A journey that could previously take months has now been shortened to a few days. This was revolutionary for trade, settlement, and political control. But behind this celebrated moment was a harsh and often brutal reality. Thousands of workers, including many Chinese immigrants in the West and Irish workers in the East, had laid tracks, blown up tunnels, built bridges, and overcome mountains under dangerous conditions. Many lost their lives, while entrepreneurs, railway companies, and investors expected huge profits. The Transcontinental Railroad profoundly changed Western North America. It facilitated settlement, brought cattle, grain, timber, and minerals to distant markets, and gave rise to new cities. At the same time, it accelerated the displacement of indigenous peoples. The rails cut through hunting grounds, allowed for the rapid deployment of troops, and encouraged the exploitation of land that had long been used by indigenous communities. The railroad therefore became not only a symbol of national unity in the USA, but also a tool of colonial violence on its own continent. What appeared to be progress for settlers meant the loss of livelihoods, autonomy, and cultural security for many indigenous peoples. Russia also saw the railway as a means of dominating vast spaces. The Russian Empire was huge, but its distances were a political and economic problem. Between European Russia, Siberia, and the Far East lay thousands of kilometers of forests, rivers, swamps, mountains, and steppes. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the construction of which began at the end of the 19th century, became one of the largest infrastructure projects in the world. It was to connect Moscow and the European part of the empire with Siberia, and finally with the Pacific. The construction was extremely demanding technically, organizationally, and humanly. Workers had to work in extreme climatic conditions, through permafrost areas, taiga, and hard-to-reach landscapes. For Russia, this railway had several meanings at the same time. Economically, it was intended to develop raw materials, promote settlement, and facilitate trade with Asia. Politically, it was intended to strengthen the Tsarist Empire's control over Siberia and the Far East. Militarily, it promised the faster deployment of troops to distant borders. But the Trans-Siberian Railway also showed the limits of imperial planning. A single route over enormous distances was vulnerable, slow to develop, and difficult to operate. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, it became clear that a large railway line promised power, but did not automatically guarantee military superiority. Supplies, organization, and capacity remained decisive. In India, under British colonial rule, the railway became one of the most important tools of imperial control. From the middle of the 19th century, the British built up an extensive railway network, which was often portrayed as a sign of modernization. In fact, the railroad greatly facilitated travel, trade, and communication on the subcontinent. It connected cities, ports, administrative centers, and production areas. But its structure strongly followed colonial interests. Many routes were used to transport raw materials such as cotton, tea, grain, or ore to ports from where they could be exported to the British Empire. The railway thus not only connected India internally, but also tied it more closely to the economic needs of the colonial power. At the same time, the Indian railways had contradictory consequences. It promoted colonial exploitation, facilitated military control, and helped the British administration respond more quickly to uprisings or crises. But it also brought people from different regions into contact with each other, facilitated pilgrimages, trade, and political communication. Later, Indian nationalists were also able to use the railway to spread ideas, build networks, and strengthen the sense of a common political space. An infrastructure that had been built for control could therefore also work in part against the rule that had created it. It is precisely this ambivalence that is one of the most important features of global railway history. In Africa, too, railways were often built under the banner of colonial interests. European powers built routes to transport raw materials from the interior of the continent to coastal ports. Rails connected mines, plantations, and administrative centers, but often not the African societies according to their own needs. Many lines ran from the interior to the coast, not between African regions. This created transport networks that were geared towards export and control. Construction was often associated with forced labor, violence, disease, and high mortality. In some regions, local communities have been forced to work or displaced from their land. The railway appeared in colonial representations as a sign of civilization, but in practice it was often an instrument of economic exploitation. A famous example is the Uganda Railway in East Africa, which was built at the end of the 19th century under British rule. It was intended to connect the Indian Ocean with the area around Lake Victoria, and thus secure British interests in the interior of East Africa. The construction was extremely difficult and costly. Workers from British India were recruited, many suffering from illness, accidents, and poor conditions. The railway changed the region permanently. It promoted trade and urban growth, but at the same time strengthened colonial control and intervened deeply in local power relations. Such projects show how closely railway, empire, and violence could be connected. In Latin America, on the other hand, railways were often built to strengthen export economies. Routes connected coffee plantations, mines, cattle areas, or agricultural regions with ports. In countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile, rails became important tools for economic modernization. They facilitated the export of raw materials and agricultural products, but also promoted dependence on world markets and foreign capital. British, French, or North American investors played an important role in many places. As a result, railways became not only national projects, but part of global financial and trade relations. Those who financed the railways often also influenced which regions were developed and what economic purposes they served. The railway across continents was therefore never just a technical achievement. It has always been a question of power. Whoever built rails decided which spaces became important, which goods flowed, which cities grew, and which people were displaced. A railway line could connect a remote region to the world market, but it could also destroy traditional ways of life. It could facilitate travel, but it could also enable military control. It could bring prosperity, but it could also deepen exploitation. This is precisely why the global railway story is so contradictory. It tells of human ingenuity and technical audacity, but also of coercion, violence, and unequal interests. Technically, these large railway projects were impressive. Engineers had to overcome mountains, bridge rivers, dig tunnels, and lay routes through climatically extreme areas. In the Rocky Mountains, in the Himalayan foothills, in the Andes, in Siberia, or in African savannas, each landscape had its own requirements. Bridge building, surveying, material transport, and workers' organization became enormous tasks. Often, temporary paths had to be created first in order to bring rails, sleepers, tools, and food to the construction sites at all. In a sense, the railroad built itself, meter by meter, threshold by threshold, supported by human labor and political will. With the continental railways, the idea of the world also changed. Spaces that were previously considered distant, dangerous, or hardly accessible were entered in timetables and maps. Distances were no longer thought of only in kilometers, but in travel times. The continent became measurable, traversable, and economically calculable. This changed the awareness of states, companies, and travelers. If you looked at a railway map, you didn't just see lines, but opportunities, raw materials, markets, settlement areas, military routes, and political control. The railways became a language of modernity, in which power and movement merged. In the end, the rails across continents were a huge step in the history of globalization. They connected inland areas with ports, raw materials with industries, people with new places of life, and states with their most remote areas. They created new cities, changed trade routes, and accelerated migration. But they also contributed to deepening land grabbing, colonial rule, and economic dependencies. The railway was thus at once a bridge and a path, a promise and a wound, progress and an instrument of domination. It made the world more closely connected, but not fairer. It is precisely in this tension that its historical significance lies. The history of railways across continents shows that technology is never neutral. She always rides on rails laid by interests, power relations, and human decisions. 10. Railway stations as gates of modernity. As the railway formed ever larger networks in the 19th century, it changed not only the landscape between the cities, but also the cities themselves. Where trains arrived and departed, new places emerged that soon became the most striking symbols of the modern world: stations. They were much more than simple stopping points. They became gates of movement, spaces of encounter, control points for trade, and stages for human stories. They condensed everything that the railroad stood for: speed, technology, order, hope, farewell, control, progress, and unrest. In the beginning, many stations were still simple. The first railway lines needed practical facilities above all: tracks, a place to board, an area for goods, perhaps a small building for tickets and administration. But with the growth of traffic, this changed quickly. The more people traveled and the more goods were moved, the larger and more complex the stations had to become. Simple stations were turned into station buildings, waiting rooms, platforms, goods sheds, locomotive sheds, workshops, signaling systems, and marshalling areas. The station became a small world of its own, in which people, machines, and goods worked together according to fixed rules. Especially in the large cities, railway stations soon took on a representative significance. They were the first building that many travelers saw when entering a city, and often the last they noticed when they left. That's why cities wanted to show that they were modern, prosperous, and important. Station buildings were designed with high halls, wide facades, large clocks, glass roofs, stone ornaments, and imposing entrances. They should not only function, but impress. A large train station said to the arrivals, "This city is part of the new era. It is accessible, connected, economically vibrant, and technically advanced." The architecture of the stations combined tradition and modernity in a special way. The front of many stations was reminiscent of palaces, town halls, or public representative buildings. It should radiate dignity, order, and security. Behind them, however, were huge halls made of iron and glass, in which locomotives smoked, wheels beat, signals sounded, and crowds of people were in motion. This connection was typical of the 19th century. Bourgeois representation was evident on the outside, while the machine of modernism was at work on the inside. The station was thus a building between old form and new strength. For the travelers, the station was a place full of emotions. This is where a journey began, where it ended, where people waited, hoped, feared, searched, and said goodbye. Families separated on the platform. Soldiers were bid farewell. Emigrants set off for an uncertain future. Businessmen hurried to appointments. Children marveled at locomotives. And workers commuted between home and work. No other place showed so clearly how much the railway changed personal lives. The station was not only a technical hub, but a space of human drama. The importance of the station was particularly low for people who left their homeland. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, railway stations became threshold places for many emigrants. Those who set out from a village or small town often first took the train to a port, from which a ship departed for America or other parts of the world. The station was then the first step out of familiar life. On the platform, hope and pain were combined. The railroad not only brought people closer together, it could also separate them from each other. It made farewell faster, more final and more massive. The station also changed the life of the city in everyday life. New districts, hotels, restaurants, warehouses, post offices, offices and shops sprang up around train stations. Roads were aligned with them. Horse-drawn trams and later trams brought passengers to the tracks. The station became the center of urban movement. Those who wanted to trade sought proximity to the railway. Anyone who opened a hotel benefited from travelers. Anyone who sent goods needed access to goods facilities. As a result, economic forces shifted within the cities. Districts that had previously been on the outskirts could gain in importance through a train station. At the same time, the station was a place of social order. Society in the 19th century was strongly influenced by class differences, and these differences were also evident in life at the station. There were separate waiting rooms for different classes of carriages, different entrances, different comfort zones, and different prices. Wealthy travelers were able to wait in quieter, better-equipped rooms, while poorer travelers often had less protection and less comfort. Although the railway brought people of different origins to the same place, it did not remove social boundaries. She rearranged them and made them visible in the area of the station. In addition to the passengers, the workers of the station played a central role. Ticket sellers, porters, conductors, switchmen, shunters, train drivers, stokers, telegraph operators, cleaners and station masters ensured that the operation functioned. Their work demanded discipline and accuracy. A mistake in a switch, a misunderstood signal, or an incorrect departure time could have serious consequences. The station was therefore also a place of control. Every movement had to be coordinated. Trains had to be distributed on tracks, wagons had to be shunted, goods had to be loaded, and passengers had to be directed. Modern mobility was not based on freedom alone, but on strict organization. The large station clock became a particularly important symbol. It not only indicated the time, but embodied a new order of life. Before the railway, many places had their own local time, which was based on the position of the sun. But rail traffic needed uniform times. Timetables, connections, and route assignments had to be precisely coordinated. The clock in the station reminded everyone that the modern world worked in minutes. Those who were late missed the train. Those who were punctual became part of a system that was bigger than the individual person. The railway thus brought a new time discipline into everyday life. Freight traffic also had a strong influence on the stations. Behind the elegant station buildings there were often large facilities for goods, coal, cattle, mail, and luggage. Boxes, barrels, sacks, machines, food, and raw materials were loaded here. Freight stations were less representative than passenger stations, but just as important economically. They connected factories to markets, farms to cities, and ports to the landlocked. In them, the industrial side of the railway was particularly evident. While travelers waited with suitcases in the front, the material flows of the modern economy were moved in the back. The station was also a place of communication. With the railway, newspapers, letters, and news spread faster. Many stations were closely connected with mail and telegraphy. Information traveled along the rails. As a result, the station became a hub not only for physical exercise, but also for news flows. Politics, trade, and the public became faster. A message from the capital could arrive in the province earlier, a business partner could respond faster, a newspaper could reach a larger area. The station was thus in the middle of the emergence of a networked society. But train stations were not only places of progress, but also places of fear and uncertainty. Crowds, noise, smoke, unknown people, and complicated timetables could overwhelm travelers. Pickpockets, fraudsters, and social hardship were also part of station life. Large train stations attracted people who were looking for work, stranded on the way, or had no permanent place in the city. The authorities therefore also saw train stations as places that had to be monitored. Police, railway officials, and regulations were supposed to create order. Modern mobility has always meant modern control. During the war, railway stations became even more important. They became gathering points for soldiers, weapons, wounded, and supplies. Regiments were bid farewell on platforms, often to music and patriotic speeches. Later, trains with the wounded returned, or people waited in vain for relatives. The station then showed the whole ambivalence of the railway. The same infrastructure that enabled travel, trade, and encounter could bring troops to the front lines and accelerate war. In peacetime, the station was a gateway to the world. In war, it could be a gateway to suffering. Over time, train stations became an integral part of the culture of remembrance. Many people associate certain life moments with them: the first big trip, a farewell, a return, an escape, a new beginning. This is why train stations appear so frequently in literature, painting, film, and photography. They are places of transition. You rarely arrive there permanently, but almost always on the way. This is exactly what makes its special atmosphere. The train station is not a home, but it can be the center of life for a brief moment. Europe's major railway stations became cathedrals of the movement. Their halls were high, their noises haunting, their processes strict and yet full of chance. People met each other for seconds and disappeared again in different directions. Trains came from distant cities and carried names, times, and destinations with them. A world appeared on the scoreboards that had become accessible. Paris, Berlin, Vienna, London, Rome, Hamburg, Munich, Moscow, or Istanbul were no longer just dots on maps, but possible travel destinations. The station made the vastness visible and accessible at the same time. In the end, stations were the spatial embodiment of what the railroad did to the world. They combined technology and feeling, order and movement, city and distance, everyday life and history. They made it visible that modernity did not only consist of machines, but of new experiences. People learned to live according to timetables, to wait on platforms, to check in luggage, to look for connections, and to think of distances in hours. The train station was the place where this new world was entered. Anyone who walked through its doors did not just enter a building, but an age in which space, time, and life were remeasured. 11. The railway in war. The railway was one of the great inventions of peace, but it became clear early on that it would also change war. What in civilian life connected cities, opened markets, and allowed people to travel faster, could set troops, weapons, ammunition, and supplies in motion in a military context. The railways thus became an invisible force behind the fronts. It did not decide on victory or defeat alone, but it changed the way states planned wars, mobilized armies, and prepared entire societies for military conflicts. Since the 19th century, war has no longer been a question of courage, tactics, and weapons, but increasingly also a question of organization, transport, and time. In front of the railroad, armies moved slowly. Soldiers marched on foot, horses pulled cannons and wagons, supply columns fought their way over bad roads. Rain, snow, mud, hunger, and exhaustion could weaken an army more than the enemy. Anyone who wanted to move troops over long distances needed weeks or months. Supply was a constant problem. An army had to eat, shoot, feed its horses, and bring back the wounded. The larger the armies became, the more difficult their movement became. The railway promised a new solution here. It was able to transport large quantities of people and materials faster and more regularly than had been possible with old means. As early as the 19th century, military planners realized that the railroad was not just a practical tool, but a strategic tool. Those who had a dense rail network were able to mobilize their army more quickly. Soldiers could be gathered from different regions and brought to the border. Cannons, horses, food, ammunition, hospital material, and equipment could be supplied in predictable quantities. As a result, the war no longer began on the battlefield, but already in the timetable office. Mobilization plans were combined with railway plans. Every train, every station, every bridge, and every route could gain military importance. An early example of the importance of the railway was the Crimean War in the 1850s. There it became clear how important transport and supplies became for modern warfare. The role of the railway in the German wars of unification became even clearer. In the 19th century, Prussia increasingly used its railway connections for military purposes. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 against Austria, the rapid movement of troops played an important role. This was even more evident in the Franco-German War of 1870 and 1871, when Prussia and its allies were able to bring large masses of troops to the French border as planned. The railroad helped to accelerate mobilization and deployment. Of course, training, leadership, weapons, and political alliances also decided the course of the war, but rail was a crucial part of military capability. This also changed the thinking of the general staffs. War was increasingly understood as a question of precise planning. If hundreds of thousands of soldiers were to be moved in a short time, nothing could be left to chance. A delayed train could block a connection, an overloaded station could stop entire units, a destroyed bridge could jeopardize an operational plan. The railroad forced the military into a new kind of bureaucracy. Tables, route maps, capacity calculations, and travel times became part of strategic thinking. Modern war thus became more technical, organized, and dependent on infrastructure. But there were two sides to this dependence. A railway line could give enormous strength, but it was also vulnerable. Rails could be blown up, bridges destroyed, tunnels blocked, and stations bombed or sabotaged. Anyone who interrupted an enemy railway line could stop supplies and slow down troop movements. That is why railway lines were guarded, repaired, and defended during war. Special railway troops were formed to lay tracks, repair damage, and establish temporary connections. The rail became a lifeline that had to be protected. An army without supplies could be so well armed, it lost its mobility and fighting power. During the First World War, this development reached a new dimension. The armies were larger than ever before, and the need for supplies was enormous. Millions of soldiers had to be brought to fronts that stretched over hundreds of kilometers. Ammunition, artillery, barbed wire, food, uniforms, spare parts, coal, horse feed, and medical supplies had to be transported continuously. The railroad was the backbone of this war machine. Without them, the great material battles could hardly have been fought. Especially on the Western Front, where the war was eating into position systems, enormous quantities of shells and supplies had to be brought in every day. At the same time, the railway contributed to the escalation of the war. Mobilization plans were often closely tied to fixed rail timetables. As soon as a state triggered its mobilization, complex transport processes began that were difficult to stop. The military logic of the railroad increased the pressure to act quickly. Those who hesitated feared that the enemy might have his troops at the front earlier. As a result, the time before the start of the war was dangerously condensed. The railroad made states faster, but it also made them more nervous. Speed became a strategic constraint. In the war itself, the railway connected home and front. It brought soldiers into the war and brought back the wounded. At train stations, young men were bid farewell to cheers, often with music, flags, and patriotic speeches. Later, hospital trains arrived there with wounded people lying exhausted, mutilated, or traumatized. The station thus became a place where the illusion of quick victory and the reality of suffering met. Families waited for news, soldiers for onward transport, the wounded for help. The railroad not only made the war more efficient, but also more visible in everyday life. The railway also played a central role in the Second World War. It transported troops, tanks, ammunition, food, and fuel over long distances. The railway was a crucial logistical instrument, especially for the German Reich, as the front stretched from France deep into the Soviet Union. However, the military expansion brought enormous problems. Different track gauges, destroyed lines, partisan attacks, lack of locomotives, fuel shortages, and congested junctions made supplies difficult. The war against the Soviet Union in particular showed that military conquest was not sustainable in the long term without stable logistics. Tanks could advance quickly, but they needed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. If the railroad did not keep up, the movement came to a standstill. During the Second World War, however, the railway was not only a military means of transport, but also became a tool of state violence and destruction. The National Socialist regime used trains to deport millions of people. Jews, Sinti and Roma and other persecuted groups were transported to ghettos, concentration camps and extermination camps. This use of the railway is one of the darkest chapters in its history. A technology that had once been celebrated as a symbol of progress and connection became part of a bureaucratically organized murder apparatus. This is precisely what shows in a shocking way that technology is not moral. The decisive factor is in whose hands it lies and what purposes it serves. The Allies also recognized the importance of the railway and targeted transport hubs, bridges, stations, and marshalling yards. Before and after the Normandy landings in 1944, railway lines in France were systematically attacked to stop German reinforcements. The war on infrastructure thus became part of the strategy itself. Not only front positions were fought, but the traffic arteries behind them. After 1945, the military importance of the railway remained, albeit under different conditions. During the Cold War, rail networks continued to play a role in troop deployments and supplies. At the same time, trucks, airplanes, and later modern logistics systems came more to the fore. Nevertheless, the railway remained important, especially for heavy transport. Tanks, artillery, and large quantities of material can often be moved efficiently on rails. Even in recent conflicts, it has been shown again and again that railway infrastructure can be strategically decisive. Anyone who controls railway junctions controls movement areas. The history of the railway in war is therefore a history full of contradictions. The same technology that enabled people to travel brought soldiers to the front. The same stations where families greeted each other became places of farewell and fear. The same rails that promoted trade and prosperity transported weapons, the wounded and the persecuted. The railroad made wars faster, bigger, and more organized. It helped states to expand their power over space and people, but it also made this power dependent on vulnerable lines of steel. In the end, it turns out that the railway was never just a peaceful machine of progress. It was a tool that could be inserted into any great force of modernity, in industry, commerce, state, military, and ideology. Their importance became particularly clear during the war, because their movement, time, and supply decided on life and death. The rail became the artery of modern war. Soldiers, weapons, food, orders, and suffering flowed through them. Anyone who wants to understand the history of the railway must therefore not ignore its military role. For it is precisely in war that the full power of this invention becomes apparent. It could connect, accelerate, and supply, but also destroy, abduct, and kill. 12. Luxury trains and long-distance travel. With the spread of the railway, not only people's everyday lives changed, but also the idea of travel itself. In the beginning, the railway had been above all a means of expediency. It took workers to their places of work, merchants to markets, soldiers to their areas of operation, and goods to ports or factories. But the denser the networks became and the longer the distances extended, the stronger a new way of traveling emerged. The railway was no longer seen only as a means of transport, but as an experience. The simple journey from one place to another became a journey through landscapes, countries, and cultures. In particular, the large long-distance trains and luxury trains of the 19th and early 20th centuries transformed the railway into a symbol of elegance, adventure, and cosmopolitanism. The basis for this was the technical and organizational progress of the railway system. Longer routes demanded better wagons, more reliable locomotives, more accurate timetables, and more convenient travel options. Those who only drove a short distance were more likely to accept narrowness, noise, and discomfort. But those who were on the road for many hours or even several days needed different conditions. The railway no longer had to be only fast, but also comfortable. Sleeping cars, dining cars, upholstered compartments, heating, lighting, and better suspension became important components of long-distance transport. This gave rise to a new culture of travel, in which speed and convenience were combined. Especially in Europe, the luxury train became a sign of social position. Wealthy travelers don't just want to arrive, they want to travel with dignity. They expected good food, clean compartments, friendly service, and an atmosphere that was more reminiscent of an upscale hotel than an ordinary means of transport. The railway thus absorbed elements of bourgeois and aristocratic life. On the train, you could eat, sleep, read, have conversations, and cross boundaries. The journey became a sliding stay between the cities. The train was no longer just a means of transcending space, but a place of life itself. The most famous expression of this development was the Orient Express. From 1883 onwards, it became a symbol of luxurious long-distance travel and connected Western Europe with Southeastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. His name evoked ideas of diplomacy, secrets, foreign cities, elegant travelers, and long nights on rails. Paris, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Sofia, and Constantinople, which later became Istanbul, became in the imagination of many people the stations of a great European and Oriental travel narrative. The Orient Express was not just a train, but a myth. He stood for the longing to cross Europe and to reach the border between the familiar and the foreign world. The Orient Express was also a product of its time. It was created in an era in which Europe was characterized by imperial interests, diplomatic rivalries, and growing international trade. Politicians, businessmen, diplomats, nobles, artists, and wealthy tourists used such connections. In the compartments and dining cars, people met who brought power, money, or cultural interest with them. The luxury train thus became a moving salon. Conversations could be just as important here as the trip itself. They exchanged messages, observed other travelers, and moved around in a space that was both public and exclusive. But the luxury of long-distance trains was based on a clear social boundary. While the wealthy travelers ate and rested in comfortable sleeping cars, poorer people often traveled in much worse conditions. In simple carriages, seats were hard, rooms narrower, and stays more strenuous. The railway made mobility possible for many, but it organized this mobility according to classes. The long-distance train showed the social differences particularly clearly. For some, travel was an experience full of comfort. For others, it remained a necessity, marked by exhaustion, costs, and uncertainty. The rail connected people, but it did not make their differences invisible. In addition to the European luxury trains, famous long-distance connections were also created in other parts of the world. In North America, long rail journeys had a different meaning. There, transcontinental routes connected the East with the West, cities with settlement areas, and coasts with inland areas. Sleeping cars and dining cars also became important facilities there because the distances were enormous. The train became a mobile habitat where travelers ate, slept, and watched the changing landscapes for days. The journey through prairies, mountains, and deserts became part of the American idea of vastness, progress, and conquest of space. Long-distance travel by rail also took on a special dimension in Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railway made it possible to travel from Europe deep into Asia. Such a journey was not only a journey between cities, but a movement through climate zones, landscapes, and cultural spaces. It showed the greatness of the empire and at the same time the attempt of the state to make this greatness controllable. Anyone who boarded a train to Siberia did not only move along rails, but through a political and geographical idea of power. Long-distance travel was therefore never just private experiences. They were always also an expression of the order that rails had created. The railway also changed tourism. Places that were previously difficult to reach could now be reached by larger groups of visitors. Health resorts, mountainous regions, coastal towns, and historic towns benefited from the rail connection. People traveled for recreation, education, or curiosity. Travel guides, timetables and hotel offers developed together with the railway traffic. The bourgeoisie in particular discovered travel as part of an educated lifestyle. People wanted to see landscapes, visit cities of art, use spas, or simply have the experience of being on the road. The railroad made these forms of travel more predictable and affordable. Long-distance transport also gave rise to a new way of perceiving it. The landscape was viewed through the train window. Mountains, fields, rivers, villages, and cities passed by like pictures in motion. The traveler was no longer directly exposed to the hardships of the journey, but sat protected in the carriage and watched the world glide by. This changed the relationship to the landscape. It became both nearer and farther at the same time. You could see large spaces, but often only fleetingly. Speed created a new aesthetic: the passing by, the change, the amazement at landscapes that one did not enter, but drove through. Luxury trains were particularly strongly associated with ideas of style and mystery. The dining car with white-covered tables, subdued lighting, porcelain, conversations in several languages, and the rhythm of the rails became an image of international modernism. You were on the road and yet surrounded by order and comfort. The outside world passed by the window, dark or light, while inside an artificial world of service, etiquette and security was created. This is exactly where the special fascination of these trains arose. They combined movement with security, adventure with control, distance with luxury. This world also found its way into literature and film. The procession became the scene of encounters, secrets, crimes, love stories, and political intrigues. The Orient Express in particular became a cultural symbol through novels and films that reached far beyond its actual transport history. The enclosed space of a train was ideal for storytelling. People of different backgrounds were locked together for a period of time while the world outside passed by. Everyone had a goal, a past, and maybe a secret. In this way, the train became a mirror of society on a small scale. But long-distance trains also had a diplomatic and political significance. Statesmen, envoys, and high officials used the train to travel to conferences, negotiations, or courts. In a time before air travel, the international train was one of the most important means of rapid political movement. At the same time, trains themselves could become political symbols. Special trains for monarchs, heads of government, or military leaders showed power and mobility. Those who owned their own train or claimed entire carriages for themselves demonstrated rank. The railway thus connected not only places, but also political staging and rule. With the advent of the automobile and later the airplane, the importance of luxury trains changed. The car promised individual freedom, the airplane extreme speed over long distances. Many classic long-distance trains lost their luster in the 20th century. Borders, wars, political upheavals, and economic changes made international train connections more difficult. The First World War destroyed the old world of elegant pre-war travel, and the Second World War changed Europe even more profoundly. Some luxury trains disappeared, others were redesigned or lost their exclusive character. However, the myth remained because it was reminiscent of an era in which the railway was considered the noblest form of long-distance travel. Nevertheless, the fascination of train travel never completely disappeared. Modern long-distance trains also carry on some of this tradition. Night trains, international express trains, and luxury tourist trains show that traveling on rails can be more than just getting around. Especially at a time when airports are often associated with stress, security checks, and confinement, many people are rediscovering the train as a slower, more conscious, and more pleasant form of travel. Anyone who travels through Europe overnight or looks at landscapes from the train window during the day experiences a combination of movement and tranquility that hardly any other means of transport offer. The history of luxury trains and long-distance journeys, therefore, shows a different side of the railway. Until now, the focus has often been on their industrial, economic, or military importance. But the railway was also a carrier of longing. It made journeys possible that made people dream. To distant cities, across borders, through mountains, to seas, to unknown cultures. It created a new culture of movement in which the path itself gained importance. The train was not only a means to an end, but a space of experience. In the end, luxury trains like the Orient Express were shining symbols of a contradictory modernity. They stood for elegance, international connection, and technical mastery, but also for social inequality, imperial perspectives, and a world that was really open to only a few. They made the distance accessible and turned travel into an experience. But they also showed that mobility always depends on who can afford it and under what conditions it takes place. Long-distance travel on rails was a promise of freedom, but not to the same extent for everyone. This is precisely why this chapter tells not only of beautiful cars and famous tracks, but of a world in which movement itself became a sign of power, status, and longing. 13. Competition from cars and planes. At the beginning of the 20th century, the railway still seemed to be unchallenged. It connected cities, supplied industrial areas, brought people to work, soldiers to the front, goods to markets, and travelers to distant countries. Railway stations were the great gates of modernity, timetables structured everyday life, and the locomotive was considered a symbol of technical power in many places. But it was precisely at the time when the railway had reached its greatest social importance that new competitors emerged that were to gradually shake its position. The automobile, the truck, and later the airplane promised a different kind of mobility. They were more flexible, more individual, or faster. This marked the beginning of a long phase in which the railway did not disappear, but had to redefine its role. The automobile first changed the idea of personal mobility. While the railway was tied to rails, stations, and timetables, the car promised freedom from fixed lines. You could leave when you wanted, stop where you wanted, and reach places that didn't have a train station. In the beginning, the automobile was a luxury for the wealthy. It was expensive, prone to failure, and for many people, more of a technical curiosity than an everyday means of transport. But with industrial mass production, better roads, and falling prices, it became more and more important. Especially after the First World War and then increasingly after the Second World War, the car developed into a symbol of personal freedom, economic advancement, and modern lifestyle in many countries. This development was dangerous for the railway, because it not only lost passengers, but also its cultural monopoly on progress. In the 19th century, the railway was considered the epitome of the future. In the 20th century, this role was increasingly taken over by the car. Advertising, politics, and urban planning presented the automobile as a sign of self-determination. The family in their own car, the road into the countryside, the weekend trip without a timetable, and the feeling of being independent became strong images. In comparison, the railways often seemed cumbersome, collective, and bound by rules. Their strength was the organization of large movements, but it was precisely this organization that now seemed to some people to be a limitation. The truck also became a powerful competitor. The railway was particularly strong when large quantities had to be transported over longer distances. But she was usually unable to bring goods directly from door to door. Goods had to be brought to the station, loaded, transported, unloaded again, and distributed. The truck was able to react more flexibly. It was able to drive directly to factories, shops, construction sites, and villages. For smaller quantities, shorter distances, or time-critical deliveries, it often became more attractive. With the expansion of roads and motorways, road freight transport became much more important. As a result, the railways lost market share, especially where flexibility was more important than quantity. This development was reinforced by political decisions. Many countries invested enormous sums in road construction in the 20th century. Motorways, highways, bridges, petrol stations, and parking lots changed the landscape. Cities were increasingly geared towards car traffic. Streets were widened, suburbs grew, shopping centers were built on the outskirts, and living, working, and shopping became more geographically distant from each other. The railway could not keep up everywhere in this new structure, because it was dependent on junctions and lines. Where people lived in sprawling suburbs and their destinations were scattered, the car seemed more practical. The railways remained strong between centers, but in some regions lost direct access to everyday life. After the Second World War, this change accelerated particularly significantly. In many European countries, destroyed railway networks had to be rebuilt. At the same time, the desire for prosperity, consumption, and individual mobility grew. Owning a car became an achievable dream for millions of people. It stood not only for transport, but for social advancement. Those who owned a car could travel, shop, visit relatives, and feel independent. The railway, on the other hand, was often associated with war destruction, old carriages, overcrowded trains, and state administration. It remained indispensable, but its luster faded. The aircraft hit the railway even harder on long distances. Air traffic began to gain in importance as early as the interwar period, but initially it remained expensive and limited. After 1945, civil aviation developed rapidly. Larger machines, safer technology, international airports, and later jet planes made travel over long distances faster and faster. Where a train took many hours or days, the plane could cover the distance in a few hours. Especially on international and intercontinental routes, the railway lost its former leading position. The luxury train, once a symbol of cosmopolitan elegance, has been replaced by the airplane as a sign of modern long-distance travel. The airplane changed the relationship between space and time even more radically than the railway. In the 19th century, the railway had brought cities closer together. The plane brought continents closer together. Business trips, diplomacy, tourism, and migration were given a new speed. Airports became the new gateways of the world, much like train stations in the century before. For the railway, this meant that it hardly remained competitive on very long distances, unless there were special geographical, political, or economic conditions. It had to focus more on medium distances, commuter traffic, and mass transport. In many countries, this led to the dismantling of railway lines. Branch lines were closed, small stations closed, freight traffic shifted to the road. Rural regions in particular lost rail connections if the operation was considered unprofitable. This had long-term consequences. Places without trains became more dependent on the car. Those who did not have a car lost mobility. At the same time, social and economic meeting places disappeared with the stations. A disused line meant not only fewer trains, but often also the loss of a connection to the larger world. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to see the railways only as a loser in this phase. It remained indispensable in many areas. In large cities and conurbations, no car could replace the performance of suburban trains, subways, regional trains, and suburban trains. Millions of people had to be moved every day, and the railways continued to be extremely efficient for this. The railways also remained strong in freight transport when large quantities were transported over long distances, such as coal, ore, steel, chemicals, containers, or agricultural products. The railroad lost its monopoly, but not its importance. In addition, the railway began to renew itself technically. Diesel locomotives and electric locomotives gradually replaced steam locomotives. That was a profound change. The steam locomotive had shaped the image of the railway, but it was labor-intensive, dirty, and complex to operate. Electric trains accelerated faster, were cleaner on the job site, and could run more efficiently in heavy traffic. Diesel rail cars were suitable for lines without overhead lines. Modern signaling technology, better carriages, more comfortable seats, and faster connections should make the railway more attractive. The railway had to prove that it was not only a legacy of the 19th century, but also had a future in the 20th century. Competition thus forced the railway to change itself. She had to rediscover her strengths. It could not win against the car everywhere, but it could be superior where many people were on the road at the same time, where city centers were congested and parking space became scarce. It was rarely able to compete with the plane on very long distances, but on medium distances it was able to score with stations in the city center, less waiting times, and greater comfort. This insight later became the basis of modern high-speed transport. The crisis of the railway thus indirectly prepared for its renewal. At the same time, the dark sides of cars and airplanes became increasingly clear. Road traffic brought traffic jams, accidents, land consumption, noise, and exhaust fumes. Cities suffer from traffic density and fragmented neighborhoods. Air traffic consumed large amounts of energy and remained heavily dependent on fossil fuels. What had long been celebrated as boundless freedom showed ecological and social costs. The railway thus appeared in a new light. It was less individual, but often more energy efficient. It was tied to fixed routes, but it was precisely this bundling that could relieve cities and regulate traffic. In retrospect, the competition from cars and airplanes shows that technical history never stands still. An invention that was once revolutionary can later be challenged itself. In the 19th century, the railway had replaced the carriage and put canals under pressure. In the 20th century, she herself was now under pressure. But it did not disappear because its basic idea remained strong: to move large quantities of people and goods reliably and efficiently on fixed routes. Their task changed, but their usefulness remained. In the end, the competition from cars and planes was not the end of the railway, but a test. It lost its luster, distances, and market share, but it also gained new clarity about its particular strengths. It had to become more modern, faster, cleaner, and more customer-friendly. The old steam world gradually developed into a new railway world with electric lines, regular timetables, express trains, and urban networks. The railway was no longer the sole queen of mobility, but it remained one of the supporting pillars of modern societies. And just when many thought it was obsolete, it was already beginning to become apparent that it could play a greater role again in a world full of traffic jams, energy issues, and environmental problems. 14. High speed and new technology. After the railway came under great pressure from cars, trucks, and planes in the 20th century, it had to reinvent itself. Many people considered it to be a means of transport of the past at times. Steam locomotives, sooty stations, and slow branch lines suddenly seemed old-fashioned in a world of highways and jet planes. But it was precisely this crisis that gave rise to a new phase in railway history. The railway began to combine its greatest strengths with modern technology: high transport capacity, predictable connections, energy efficiency, and the ability to take people directly from city center to city center. Step by step, the old symbol of industrialization became a means of transport of the future. The most important change was initially the farewell to the steam locomotive. For more than a century, it had shaped the image of the railway. Its smoke, its whistling, its stomping, and its visible power made it a myth. But in practical operation, the steam locomotive was complex. She needed coal, water, a lot of maintenance work, and physically hard work. Engine drivers and stokers worked under heat, smoke, and great pressure. Steam locomotives had to be cleaned, filled, and prepared regularly. They were less and less suitable for modern, dense, and reliable rail traffic. Therefore, they were gradually replaced by diesel and electric locomotives. Electrification was one of the decisive steps into the new railway era. Electric trains were able to accelerate faster, were cleaner in operation on the job site, and were particularly suitable for busy routes. They were quieter, more powerful, and could run closer together if signals and routes were developed accordingly. In mountainous regions, electric locomotives showed their advantages early on because they were better able to cope with steep gradients. Later, electric traction became the backbone of modern express trains. It made it possible to reliably transfer large outputs to the rails without each locomotive having to carry its own fuel. At the same time, signal and safety technology continued to develop. The faster trains travel, the more important safety becomes. A train driver can no longer drive on sight alone at very high speeds. Braking distances become longer, reaction time shorter, and errors can have catastrophic consequences. As a result, signaling systems, automatic train control, and later digital controls became increasingly important. Modern railways are not only based on powerful engines, but also on a complex interplay of tracks, power supply, control centers, brakes, sensors, radio links, and computers. High speed is therefore not a single vehicle, but an entire system. The decisive breakthrough of modern high-speed transport came from Japan. After World War II, Japan was faced with the task of rebuilding its economy and better connecting its major cities. The route between Tokyo and Osaka was particularly important because it connected two economic centers and was heavily utilized. In 1964, just in time for the Olympic Games in Tokyo, the Shinkansen was opened. This train became a worldwide symbol of a new railway. It was fast, punctual, modern, and technically reliable. While many countries were still debating whether the railways had a future, Japan showed that with new technology it could be at the forefront of transport. The Shinkansen was not simply a faster train on old tracks. It was based on its own high-speed line, which was planned for high speeds. Curve radii, gradients, track quality, power supply, and safety systems were designed for fast travel. This was a fundamental difference from many older railway lines that had originally been built for slower trains. High speed requires a different infrastructure. Tight curves, level crossings, weak bridges, or mixed traffic with slow freight trains limit the speed. The Shinkansen showed that the future of the fast railroad could lie in specialized routes. Europe also took up this idea. France in particular became a pioneer of high-speed transport. From 1981 onwards, the TGV, the train à grande vitesse, became a symbol of French engineering on the route between Paris and Lyon. France relied heavily on its own high-speed lines that connected large cities with each other. The goal was clear: the train should compete with the plane at medium distances. Between two city centers, a fast train could have great advantages. Travelers did not have to drive far outside to the airport, did not have to go through long security checks, and could arrive directly in the center. The TGV proved that the railways are particularly strong where speed, comfort, and central location come together. Germany took a slightly different path. The IC became the flagship of Deutsche Bahn from 1991 onwards. It combined high speed with a network that consisted more strongly of many nodes than the French model, which was centrally oriented towards Paris. Germany had many large cities, but not a single dominant capital to the same extent as France. Therefore, high-speed transport had to be more closely integrated into a federal, dense, and historically grown network. New high-speed lines were built, for example between Hanover and Würzburg or Mannheim and Stuttgart, later also between Cologne and Frankfurt and between Nuremberg and Erfurt. The IC became the symbol of a modernized railway that was intended to appeal to business travelers, commuters, and long-distance travelers alike. High speed changed travel again. Distances that used to mean a longer day's journey could now be overcome in a few hours. Cities moved closer together. A business meeting in another metropolis became easier, a weekend visit more realistic, a trip without a car more attractive. It was not only about absolute speed, but also about reliable travel time. If a train travels directly from the center of one city to the center of another, it can be competitive even if an airplane is faster in the air. The entire journey counts, not just the speed of the vehicle. In addition to Japan, France, and Germany, other countries also developed modern high-speed train networks. Italy expanded its Duratissima and later fast connections between major cities such as Rome, Florence, Milan, and Naples. Spain has invested heavily in the Avenue network since the 1990s and connected Madrid with many parts of the country. China began an unprecedented expansion of high-speed rail in the 21st century. Within a short time, the largest express train network in the world was built there. This development shows that high speed is not only a technical prestige project, but is also understood as a means of national development. High-speed trains connect regions, strengthen domestic markets, and demonstrate technical capability. But high speed is expensive. New routes cost enormous sums of money. Tunnels, bridges, noise protection, land, stations, power supply, and security systems require long-term investments. Not every connection is economically worthwhile. Especially in sparsely populated regions, the construction of high-speed lines can be problematic. In addition, new routes interfere with landscapes, cause conflicts with residents and change spaces. The modern railway thus remains a political project, as it was in the 19th century. It's about money, planning, interests, the environment, regional justice, and national priorities. Technically, the railway also continued to develop beyond classic wheels on rails. The idea of the maglev train was particularly fascinating. Instead of rolling on wheels, such a train hovers over its lane by magnetic forces. This creates less friction and makes very high speeds possible. Germany developed a well-known system with the Transrapid, but it was never implemented in a large route network in its own country. In Shanghai, a commercial maglev train was later built that connects the airport with the city. Magnetic levitation technology showed how far the search for speed could go, but also how difficult it is to enforce new systems against existing infrastructures. A train on rails can use existing networks. A maglev train needs its own route. At the same time, the everyday trains also became more modern. High speed is spectacular, but for most people, reliable regional and local transport is just as important. Modern multiple units, suburban trains, subways, and regional express lines shape the daily lives of many millions of people. Air conditioning, barrier-free entrances, digital displays, Wi-Fi, better brakes, and energy-efficient drives change the travel experience. Railways have not only become faster, but also more convenient and more integrated into digital systems. Tickets can now be booked online, connections are calculated in apps, delays are displayed, and train movements are monitored in control centers. Digitization is perhaps the next big technical revolution in the railway. Modern control systems can make better use of routes, make trains run more densely, and detect faults more quickly. Automation is playing an increasingly important role, especially in urban traffic. Driverless subways are already a reality in several cities. On large railway networks, full automation is more difficult because mixed traffic, weather, open lines, and complex operating conditions are demanding. Nevertheless, digital technology is already changing planning, maintenance, and operation. Sensors can monitor the condition of vehicles and tracks before damage becomes a major problem. Data helps save energy and improve schedules. Another important area is the energy question. Railways are often considered more climate-friendly than cars and planes, especially if they are electrically powered and supplied with renewable electricity. Modern trains partially reuse braking energy, consume relatively little energy per person at high capacity, and can bundle large traffic flows. This is precisely why the railways are receiving new political attention in the 21st century. What was once considered old-fashioned now appears to be a solution to crowded streets, rising emissions, and the search for sustainable mobility. High speed is only part of the answer. Equally important are good connections, reliable intervals, modern stations, and affordable services. Despite all the technical advances, the railway remains vulnerable to old problems. Delays, congested routes, construction sites, outdated infrastructure, and high costs can shake the confidence of travelers. A modern train is of little use if the network is too tight, maintenance is too scarce, or the timetable is too sensitive. The history of the railway therefore shows again and again that technology alone is not enough. The system is decisive. Rails, trains, personnel, energy, maintenance, politics, and financing must fit together. This was already the case with the early locomotives, and it is even more true for high-speed trains. In the end, the era of high speed shows that the railway has never lost its versatility. It began with wooden rails and mines, became the force of industrialization through steam, came under pressure from cars and airplanes, and then found a new role with electrification, high-speed lines, and digital technology. The Shinkansen, the TGV, the IC, and other modern trains prove that the railway is not just a thing of the past. It can also be the future. Their strength lies in connecting many people quickly, securely, and comparatively efficiently. In a world that needs mobility but is increasingly feeling its costs, the railway is once again appearing as one of the most important means of transport of our time. It has changed, but its basic promise has remained: to connect people and places and to make distances tangible in a new way. 15. The future of railways. The history of the railway began with a desire to move heavy loads more easily. Simple rails and mines became a worldwide transport system that accelerated industries, grew cities, influenced wars, connected continents, and changed the lives of millions of people. But the railway is not a finished story. It doesn't just belong in museums, on old photographs, or in the memory of steaming locomotives. Especially in the 21st century, it is once again at the center of major questions. How do people want to travel in the future? How can cities be relieved? How can goods be transported without overcrowding roads more and more? How can mobility work when energy, climate, and quality of life are becoming increasingly important? The railway, which was long considered an invention of the industrial age, suddenly appears again as a means of transport of the future. The most important reason for this lies in the climate issue. Modern societies depend on mobility, but this mobility comes at a high price. Cars consume space, cause traffic jams, noise, and exhaust fumes. Airplanes connect large distances quickly, but require enormous amounts of energy. Freight transport by road continues to grow in many regions and puts a strain on cities, motorways, and the environment. The railway offers a decisive advantage here. It can move large quantities of people and goods with comparatively low energy consumption, especially if it is electrically powered and supplied with electricity from renewable sources. This makes it a central component of sustainable transport policy. But sustainability alone is not enough. People choose a means of transport not only for moral reasons, but because it is reliable, convenient, affordable, and practical. The future of the railway, therefore, depends on whether it is convincing in everyday life. A fast train is of little use if connections do not work, stations are difficult to reach, or tickets seem too complicated. The railway of the future must be more than a series of modern trains. It must be a well-coordinated system in which long-distance transport, regional transport, urban transport, bicycles, buses, and footpaths are meaningfully interlinked. The station will once again become an important hub, not only as a place to board, but also as a center of networked mobility. This task is particularly evident in Europe. The continent has many cities that are relatively close to each other. This is exactly where the railway can be strong. On medium-haul routes, for example between large metropolises, it can compete with the aircraft if it is fast, direct, and reliable. A train traveling from city center to city center saves distances to distant airports, long waiting times, and complicated security procedures. High-speed trains have already shown that many people are willing to replace the plane if rail offers a real alternative. The future could therefore lie in a denser European high-speed train network, which makes borders less noticeable and makes travel within Europe easier. Night trains are also experiencing a special renaissance. For a long time, they were considered old-fashioned and uneconomical in many countries. But in the meantime, more and more people are rediscovering their value. A night train combines travel time and sleep time. You get on in one city in the evening and arrive in another in the morning. For many routes, this can be an attractive alternative to flying. Night trains also have an emotional quality that hardly any other means of transport offers. The quiet rolling through the darkness, waking up in a different landscape, the feeling of being on the road and yet coming to rest, ties in with the old culture of long-distance travel. The future of the railway therefore consists not only of speed, but also of a new appreciation of conscious travel. At the same time, freight transport by rail will play a decisive role. Modern economies move huge quantities of goods every day. Containers, raw materials, food, machinery, and consumer goods must be transported between ports, factories, warehouses, and cities. If this traffic grows exclusively on the road, traffic jams, emissions, and high burdens on infrastructure and people will occur. The railways can bundle large quantities here and move them efficiently over long distances. Especially in combination with modern freight terminals, digital control and good distribution on the last route, it can be an important part of sustainable logistics. The challenge is to integrate rail into supply chains more flexibly, faster, and more reliably. Digitization will become increasingly important. Trains, tracks, signals, and timetables are already controlled by complex data streams. In the future, digital systems could help to make better use of routes, detect delays earlier, and plan maintenance more proactively. Sensors on trains and tracks can report when a component wears out before it fails. Digital interlockings can make operations more efficient. Automatic train control can help to keep more trains running safely, especially on busy routes. The railway of the future will therefore consist not only of steel and electricity, but also of data, algorithms, and networked control systems. But even the most modern technology does not solve all problems. Many rail networks suffer from decades of neglect. When bridges are old, tracks are overloaded, stations are outdated, and routes are too tight, no modern train can reach its full potential. The future of the railways therefore requires major investments and political patience. Rail infrastructure does not happen overnight. Tunnels, bridges, new lines, electrification, and station conversions need time, money, and social approval. This shows an old truth of railway history: the railway is always a public project. Even if private companies are involved, it remains closely linked to state planning, spatial planning, and the common good. There will also be conflicts. New routes mean interventions in landscapes. Residents fear noise. Regions are fighting for connections. Taxpayers are asking about costs. Environmental associations weigh up climate benefits against local interventions. Business and politics are arguing about priorities. These conflicts are not new. As early as the 19th century, there were disputes about routes, land, investments, and benefits. The railway was never just technology. It has always been politics. Their future will therefore not be decided solely in engineering offices, but in parliaments, municipalities, citizens' initiatives, and social debates. The social question also remains important. A sustainable railway must not only be a means of transport for wealthy travelers. If mobility is part of social participation, then trains must remain affordable and accessible. People without cars, the elderly, young people, commuters, and residents of rural regions need reliable connections. Especially in rural areas, the future of the railways is difficult, but crucial. Where routes have been shut down, dependence on the car has often grown. A clever transport policy therefore does not have to promise high speed everywhere, but also strengthen regional networks, improve frequencies, and secure connections. The future does not only mean that it can be achieved more quickly, but also more fairly. The railway could also help to make cities more livable. If more people travel by train, S-Bahn, U-Bahn, or tram, the pressure on roads and parking areas decreases. Cities can become quieter, cleaner, and more people-friendly. Train stations and stops can form new city centers, around which living, working, and shopping are better connected. So a good train not only changes travel between cities, but also life in them. It can help mobility take up less space and create less stress. Despite all the opportunities, the future of the railways should not be romanticized. It will not replace every car, it will not make every aircraft superfluous, and it will not be able to connect every region perfectly. For some journeys, the car remains practical. For very long distances, the plane remains important, and flexible solutions are needed for sparsely populated areas. The strength of the railway is not to be able to do everything, but to be particularly good where many people or large quantities of goods have to be moved regularly. Their future depends on using this strength wisely and combining it with other means of transport. In the end, a large historical circle closes. The railway came into being because people wanted to make routes more predictable, loads more mobile, and distances more surmountable. Today we are faced with similar questions. only under different conditions. Again, it is about energy, economy, space, and time. Again, it is about how societies organize their movement. But this time a new responsibility is added. Mobility should not only be faster and more efficient, but also more sustainable, fairer, and more humane. The railway cannot offer a simple miracle solution for this, but it has characteristics that point to the future. Perhaps its greatest power lies in the fact that it creates connection. It connects cities and villages, people and markets, past and future. She reminds us that progress does not only consist of more and more speed, but also of clever order, common infrastructure, and the ability to solve large tasks together. From the wooden rails of mines to high-speed digital networks, the railway has always been a mirror of its time. In the 19th century, it stood for industrialization. In the 20th century, it had to hold its own against cars and planes. In the 21st century, it could become a symbol of the fact that modern mobility does not necessarily have to become louder, more hectic, and more destructive. It can also be more connected, cleaner, and more conscious. That's exactly why the history of the railway is not over yet. It continues to travel, on old and new rails, into a future that we have yet to shape.